The Palace of Versailles, often called the Golden Cage of the French monarchy, held a secret far more profound than any affair or political intrigue. It was a truth of betrayal against nature itself, a forbidden masterpiece of engineering and blasphemy. We speak of the Sun King's own bloodline, the very thread of the Bourbon Dynasty, which was slowly poisoned by a devastating, shameful genetic curse. To conceal this terrifying decay from their court, their enemies and their god, the most powerful family in Europe, committed the ultimate historical lie. They did not banish their afflicted sons. They replaced them. Deep within the shadow-drenched wings of the palace, there was a secret guild of artisans, forced to construct an anatomical impossibility, lifelike, silent, mechanical duplicates of the royal heirs. These were not toys. They were substitute princes, carved from ivory, leather, and clockwork brass, built to breathe and nod and move in perfect imitation. For years, Europe bowed to a hoax, a deception of gears and springs. The true heir was hidden, the clockwork heir paraded. This is the buried knowledge of a monarchy that traded its soul for perfection. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The path we follow leads away from the grand salons and the endless glittering mirrors. It takes us into the quieter, forgotten depths of the palace's structure. Where the light is forever dim, the chambers are quiet, and the faint scent of aged parchment and dry, oiled clockwork fills the air. We are searching for a shadow in the gilded halls, an echo of a life that was never quite alive. We are looking for the truth behind the velvet curtain, where the illusion of eternal majesty was maintained at a horrifying, hidden cost. The history we read in books, the history we learned in schoolrooms, is often the history the powerful wish us to remember. It is a seamless narrative of glory, divine right, and perfect succession. But history is like an old tapestry, beautiful on the front, yet behind it, all is tangled knots and messy, concealed threads. The great House of Bourbon, rising to its zenith under Louis XIV, believed they had achieved a unique position, a semi-divine right, a physical and political perfection ordained by heaven itself. This belief became the source of their greatest strength and their ultimate, most terrifying weakness. The weakness was rooted in the very purity they sought to enforce. For generations, the royal intermarriages, the political unions designed to stabilize Europe, had the insidious side effect of concentrating a specific, debilitating genetic flaw. It was not a flaw that killed quickly. It was one that eroded the mind, seized the limbs, and twisted the features. It was a curse of the blood, magnified by the crown. The arrival of a new, high-risk heir was always accompanied by a quiet, mounting tension in the palace, a tension that could be cut with a jeweled knife. The moment a child of France was born, every physician, every court lady, and every royal tutor became a silent, fearful observer. They were watching not for the sparkle of genius, but for the slow, dreadful signs of the curse's manifestation. If the child began to show the telltale symptoms, a chain of command was activated, a chain that led not to a cure, but to the deepest, most sealed-off sections of the royal complex. These sections were known only as the chambers, deambres of chambers of shadow. They were not dungeons. They were something far more refined and terrifying. They were laboratories of deception, maintained in perpetual silence. And it was here, in the cold, windowless rooms, that the grand lie began to take mechanical shape. The official narrative had to be maintained at all costs. The successor to the most powerful throne in the world could not be seen as flawed. The failure of the king's blood would imply the failure of God's favor, unraveling the entire spiritual and political fabric of the dynasty. The solution, proposed by a forgotten cardinal and executed by an exiled guildmaster of watchmakers, was to bypass biology entirely. If the true heir could not be presented, then a perfect simulation of the heir must be built. The forbidden knowledge required for this task was rooted in obscure texts on anatomical automata, taken from captured Turkish workshops and ancient Italian models of human movement. The artisans brought into the chambers deambres were treated as both precious resources and total prisoners. They were the secret artificers. Their workshops were furnished with the finest materials: African mahogany for skeletal structures, the palest European ivory for hands and faces, and thousands of tiny, perfectly cut gears forged from specially selected, non-rusting alloys. Their reward for this perfect work was lifelong service. Their punishment for speaking a single word was a swift, silent end. They were the architects of the lie, and their collective genius became the most profound state secret. The initial task was daunting: to replicate the living presence of a 3-year-old prince. Every measurement, every slight tilt of the head, every habitual gesture had to be catalogued. The process was chillingly invasive. Court painters were ordered to create hundreds of detailed, unnervingly accurate sketches, noting the precise placement of veins beneath the skin, the shade of the iris, and the way the royal chin rested when the prince was deep in thought. These measurements were then transposed onto blueprints of brass and wood. The internal structure of the automaton, the mechanical skeleton, was a marvel of early engineering, designed to mimic the natural weight and balance of a human child. The legs contained miniature systems of counterweights to ensure a natural gait, and the torso housed a subtle mechanism powered by compressed air, which allowed the mechanical chest to rise and fall, creating the illusion of breathing. The skin of these mechanical princes, fashioned from layers of cured leather and expertly treated ivory powder mixed with pigments, was perhaps the most crucial element of the deception. It had to be soft, warm to the touch, and capable of holding the blush of artificial life under the harsh scrutiny of candlelight. The artisans developed a secret varnish, a mixture of rare resins and oils, that created a subtle, lifelike sheen, mimicking the sweat and movement of actual human skin. The hands, visible during any formal greeting or kiss of the ring, were perfected through agonizing detail. Each nail bed painted with a delicate blue tint to suggest circulating blood. The eyes, however, were the greatest challenge. They were crafted from rock crystal, polished to a perfect, unblinking clarity. While the automaton could be programmed to move its head and arms with astounding fluidity, the eyes remained the weak point. They did not blink naturally, and they held an uncanny, still concentration that often unnerved those who looked too closely. This was why the royal attendants were strictly instructed to never look the young prince directly in the eye for prolonged periods, a habit that quickly became a subtle, unwritten rule of the court. The true prince, meanwhile, was sequestered in an entirely different wing of the palace. He was not abused, but he was isolated, surrounded only by highly trusted, silent nurses and a single physician. His life was one of profound quiet, a stark contrast to the brilliant clamor of the court just a few hundred yards away. The prince was often aware of the sounds of the celebration, the distant music, the muffled applause, all directed at the magnificent lie that wore his face. This awareness created a crushing psychological burden, both for the child, who knew he was imitated, and for the nurses, who witnessed the moral decay up close. The royal parents, the king and queen, were forced to live this double life. They had to perfect the art of public affection for the clockwork heir, ensuring their gestures were convincing and heartfelt, while maintaining a distant clinical relationship with their true son. This continuous performance eroded their own humanity. They became masters of the theatrical mask, sacrificing their genuine parental instincts for the preservation of the throne. It was an institutionalized betrayal that gnawed at the heart of the dynasty. The presence of the automaton demanded a whole new level of security and ritual. The clockwork heir was never permitted to speak naturally. His appearances were restricted to formal, silent events, parades, state dinners where conversation was ritualistic and brief, or religious processions where the crowd's distance obscured the necessary stillness in his eyes. When interaction was required, a mechanism allowed for a limited, pre-recorded set of royal affirmations, activated by a subtle, hidden touch from a handler. The resulting sound was often muffled, slightly metallic, and profoundly unsettling. Yet, in the haze of courtly reverence, It was dismissed as the soft-spoken nature of royalty. This mechanical deception was costly, not just in gold, but in fear. The secret artificers, who held the blueprints and the knowledge of maintenance, were the most powerful and the most threatened men in the kingdom. If they escaped, if they spoke, the truth would not just ruin the king. It would ignite a panic that could destabilize all of Europe. One story often whispered among the guards who served in the chamber's day. Umbers concerned a particularly brilliant artisan, a man known only as Lay. Rue, he had successfully completed the most intricate mechanism, the wrist and hand movements of the automaton, making them capable of signing documents with a perfect imitation of the prince's developing script. Leroux, however, had fallen in love with a seamstress who worked in the main palace. In a moment of dangerous human folly, he attempted to pass her a note, a tiny scrap of parchment containing a single, cryptic sketch of a brass gear. The note, though never read by the seamstress, was intercepted by the captain of the king's Black Garda Corps, sworn not to military duty, but to the maintenance of the lay. Leroux was not executed publicly. That would have drawn undue attention. Instead, he was returned to his chamber, given a special vintage of wine mixed with a fast-acting, odorless draught. He died in his sleep, his final, brilliant invention, the signing hand resting beside him on the workbench. The next morning, a replacement artisan, already groomed and isolated for years, was brought in. His first task was to dismantle the final work of Leroux, learning its secrets before burying the brass components under the workshop floor. A quiet, metallic burial for forbidden knowledge. The seamstress, realizing her admirer had vanished, became haunted by the brief, terrifying interaction. She began to notice things about the young prince that others dismissed: the perfect, unnatural stillness of his hands during a prayer, the way his velvet coat seemed to conceal a rigidness in his spine, or the time she swore she heard a faint, high-pitched whirring sound as he turned his head too quickly during a palace fete. She was observing the physical evidence of the deception. The subtle failures of the mechanical double. The king's court physician, Dr. Antoine Dubois, was perhaps the only person outside the Black Guard who understood the full measure of the moral decay this deception required. Dubois was tasked with monitoring the health of both the true, fragile prince and the mechanical impostor. His journal, kept in a microscript of excruciating detail, became the true, hidden history of the Bourbon succession. Dubois wrote not of symptoms, but of the silence. He noted that the sequestered true prince, though physically declining, possessed a powerful, desperate, human soul trapped behind faulty wiring. The automaton, however, possessed only the terrifying silence of flawless design. Dubois confessed to an increasing terror that he was spending more time maintaining the machine than the human being. One entry, dated October 1745, describes a state dinner, a particularly long and ornate affair. The mechanical prince was seated beside the queen, programmed for minimal interaction. Dubois noted a flaw in the humidity-controlled environment of the dining hall. The air was too warm and thick, causing a minuscule expansion in the complex metal joints of the automaton's shoulder. As the king gave a celebratory toast, the mechanical arm, intended only to raise a cup slowly, suffered a momentary, near-catastrophic failure. Instead of a smooth lift, the arm jerked violently, spraying wine across the velvet tablecloth and onto a visiting Austrian ambassador. The resulting silence was immediate, profound, and colder than any winter in Versailles. The queen, a woman hardened by years of participating in the lie, instinctively reacted. She did not apologize for the child. She apologized for the wine, feigning a sudden illness and moving the automaton quickly away from the light. Later that night, in the secrecy of the Chambers des Ombres, Dubois recorded the damage and the repair. He wrote a chilling reflection in his journal. The machine fails not through malice, but through the honesty of physics. The king, in choosing this mechanical perfection, chose a successor bound not by blood or love, but by the relentless, indifferent laws of heat and stress. We are ruled by a subtle, ticking tyrant. This event, the sound of the gears that night, was a pivotal moment. It exposed the extreme fragility of the entire cover-up. The king realized that the mechanism was too complex for public use, and thus began the transition to the next phase of the lie, engineering a swift, respectable, and perfectly timed death for the mechanical double. The decision to eliminate the clockwork heir was not one of pity, but of cold calculation. A flawless, living replica could be maintained in secret, but it was too great a liability in public. The moral decay had progressed to the point where the king could rationalize the staged death of an innocent machine as a necessary act of statecraft, a final, grand theatrical production designed to secure the crown. The challenge was timing. The true prince, fragile and declining in his isolation, needed to be near enough to death that his actual passing, when it inevitably occurred, would not be scrutinized too closely. Conversely, the mechanical prince needed to die just soon enough to create a period of respectful, unquestioning mourning. The final ritual of the mechanical prince was meticulously planned. It was to be a sudden, brief illness, a fever of the blood, a common enough affliction in the era. The royal physicians issued increasingly grim bulletins over 3 days, carefully noting symptoms that perfectly matched the internal stress fractures and friction points developing within the automaton's mechanisms. On the final night, the mechanical heir was placed in the royal cradle, bathed in soft, obscuring candlelight. The secret artificers, under the direct supervision of the Black Guard, were brought in one last time. They did not perform maintenance. They performed a ritual deactivation. They quietly opened a small, camouflaged panel beneath the prince's shoulder blade and extracted the primary tension spring, the heart of the machine. The effect was immediate. The slight rise and fall of the chest ceased. The artificial warmth in the ivory faded, and the limbs settled into a profound, terrifying stillness. The silence that followed was the true sound of the lie succeeding. The court was plunged into deep mourning, a wave of performative grief that washed across Paris and the surrounding provinces. The public wept for the young prince, unaware that their tears were shed for a perfectly crafted lie. This period of genuine public sorrow served a crucial, secondary purpose for the king. It allowed him to gauge the depth of his subjects' loyalty, confirming that the foundation of his divine right was still intact. Regardless of the successor, the actual burial was an exercise in controlled deception. The coffin, ornate and perfectly sealed, did not contain the mechanical double. Instead, it was weighted with lead and symbolically sealed with the royal crest. The body of the automaton, which contained the dangerous, forbidden knowledge of the blueprints within its structure, was instead taken to a deep, forgotten vault beneath the chamber's d'ambres. It was deemed too valuable to destroy, too dangerous to leave accessible. The vault was not sealed with stone, but with a complex series of countersprung traps and mechanical deterrents designed by the artificers themselves, a final, terrifying irony. The prince, who was a machine, was entombed in a machine of a tomb. Dr. Dubois recorded the entire sequence in his journal, his hand visibly shaking. The deception is complete. We have successfully buried the truth beneath the weight of a royal funeral. The moral decay is now absolute. We have taught the people to mourn the false, leaving no emotion left for the real. The king weeps not for his son, but for the success of his stagecraft. The stage was now set for the next, equally cruel act, the introduction of the true, frail prince. He was renamed, given a new identity, and presented as a miracle recovery, a cousin brought in from a forgotten, distant branch of the family to be trained as the new heir. This narrative required the court to willfully forget the previous few years, accepting the new, fragile child with a quiet, polite submission. The introduction of the new heir. The true surviving prince under a manufactured identity required a collective and profound act of institutionalized amnesia. The court was expected to believe that this sickly, withdrawn child, who possessed an uncanny sadness in his eyes, was a distant, previously unheard of relative suddenly brought into the light. No one dared to publicly connect the delicate newcomer with the robust, unblinking image of the recently deceased mechanical prince. This systemic denial represented a deeper form of moral decay than even the initial act of creating the automaton. It was the forced submission of an entire nobility to an obvious, impossible lie. It meant sacrificing personal observation for political safety. To question the legitimacy of the new heir was not just treason. It was to admit knowledge of the chilling, forbidden truth that the Sun King's dynasty was built upon a clockwork fraud. The new prince, let us call him Louis, though his official title was subtly altered, carried the weight of two burdens, his own failing health, and the memory of the machine that had taken his place. He had lived in isolation, acutely aware of the charade. Now, placed on the throne, he was forced to mimic the very mannerisms that the automaton had been programmed to display. He had to be less expressive, less spontaneous, more reserved than a normal child, because the court had been conditioned to accept the silence as the hallmark of true royalty. The moral horror intensified. For the young Louis, his training involved watching carefully guarded sketches of the automaton in motion, studying the precise arc of the hand gesture and the measured cadence of the mechanical movements. He was, in essence, being coached by the ghost of his own mechanical double, the king and queen, worn down by years of double life and deception, struggled to connect with their true son. Their instincts had been warped by the years they had spent lavishing public affection on a machine. The genuine, fragile humanity of the boy now felt alien to them. They were accustomed to the perfection of the inanimate. They were unable to cope with the imperfections of the living. This psychological separation created an emotional void at the heart of the monarchy. The king, obsessed with the stability of the crown, found himself preferring the cold, unyielding certainty of the automaton's memory to the unpredictable reality of his son's fragile existence. This obsession led to the creation of the archives of the forgotten. In a sealed-off room adjacent to the chambers des ombres, the king commanded that every single blueprint, every journal entry by the artificers, and every maintenance note by Dr. Dubois concerning the mechanical prince be meticulously preserved. This was his true hidden treasury. It was the record of his perfect, failed creation. He would often spend hours alone in this quiet chamber, surrounded by the blueprints of the mechanical body that had served his throne better than his own blood. It was here, in the soft, flickering light of the candles, that the king committed his deepest act of moral decay, contemplating whether he should have simply destroyed his true son and declared the automaton to be miraculously cured, ruling through the machine permanently the threat of this forbiddance. Knowledge did not die with the mechanical prince. The artificers, though replaced, had apprentices. The blackguard, though loyal, was mortal, and Dr. Dubois's journal, too dangerous to destroy, was hidden behind a rotating section of the archives, its pages brittle with the truth. As the years passed and the new Louis ascended to the throne, the burden of the lie became internalized. The king had learned that true power lay not in force, but in controlling the collective perception of reality. He instituted sweeping changes to the curriculum taught at the royal academies, subtly promoting the idea that physical weakness was a spiritual failing and that emotional reserve was the height of noble strength, reinforcing the very qualities the machine had inadvertently projected. The dynasty, now built on the silence and stillness of a clockwork ghost, became emotionally remote, psychologically isolated, and profoundly cruel. This subtle shift in the Bourbon character, this lack of genuine empathy, was the ultimate poisonous legacy of the mechanical heir. Final. Devastating legacy of the clockwork lie was the eventual psychological collapse that permeated the entire court. The generation that followed Louis, the grandchildren of the king who commissioned the automaton, grew up in an atmosphere of profound emotional sterility. They were taught to distrust spontaneity and to fear any display of genuine vulnerability, viewing it as a sign of the genetic flaw. Their ancestors had worked so desperately to conceal this deliberate suppression of human emotion, designed to mirror the perfection of the machine, slowly isolated the monarchy from the very people they ruled. The distance between the detached, cold perfection of the court and the messy, volatile reality of the French populace grew vast and unbridgeable. This chasm was the true, silent cause of the gathering storm that would eventually lead to the revolution. The people did not hate the king merely for his taxes. They resented the unfeeling, mechanical indifference that seemed to govern his every decision, and indifference he had learned from a brass automaton. Dr. Dubois's journal provides a harrowing postscript. In his final entry, written years after the mechanical heir's death, he reflects on the nature of the secret. He concluded that the creation of the clockwork prince had not saved the dynasty. It had merely preserved the form while poisoning the soul. The forbidden's knowledge had created a generation of rulers who were psychologically, if not physically, more like machines than men. They were rigid, predictable, and entirely lacking the necessary elasticity of human empathy required to govern a complex nation. He described a chilling scene: the reigning king, sitting alone in the archives of the forgotten, not looking at the blueprints, but simply running his hand over a piece of the automaton's ivory skin that had been preserved as a relic. Dubois believed the king was unconsciously seeking the perfection and the quiet certainty of the machine, rejecting the flawed, tumultuous reality of his own humanity. The moral decay had come full circle. The king preferred the memory of the lie to the truth of his life, the secret vault beneath the chamber's day ambers, the final resting place of the automaton's shell, became a silent, hidden monument to the monarchy's ultimate sin. It was a secret passed down through a select line of the Black Guard, a tradition of guardianship defined by the total eradication of personal history and a vow of absolute silence. They guarded not gold or jewels, but the terrifying physical evidence of the deception that had sustained their empire. The vault and the automaton within it remained untouched for decades, its presence a constant, subterranean whisper beneath the palace's splendor. It was a ticking clock of shame, waiting for the political pressure to build to the point where the foundation of the palace and the dynasty would finally crack. A moment of this dark historical chapter arrived not with a thunderclap, but with the inevitable eruption of suppressed truth. When the revolution finally came, and the enraged populace stormed the symbols of royal authority, they did not find the mechanical prince. They found the documents, the ledgers, and the outward signs of greed. But years later, during a necessary renovation of the palace grounds, long after the execution of the final king, the sealed vault was accidentally breached by laborers digging a new drainage tunnel. The discovery was not of gold, but of a forgotten machine preserved by the dry, cold ere the lifeless shell of the automaton. It lay there, a perfectly preserved, terrifying replica of a young prince, its ivory skin yellowed but intact, its limbs locked in the eternal stillness of permanent deactivation. The complex brass mechanisms inside were cold, silent, and entirely incomprehensible to the 19th century engineers, who eventually examined it. The historical record could not process what they found. The object was too advanced, too perfect, and too profoundly disturbing. The new government, wary of creating any new conspiracy theories that might undermine the stability of the republic, made a political decision born of the same fear that had driven the Bourbon king. Silence. The automaton was quietly dismantled, its components scattered among private collectors and obscure museums, mislabeled as early demonstration models or anatomical teaching aids. The forbidden's knowledge was physically erased, but the shadow it cast on the Bourbon reign, the chilling understanding that the crown had preferred the perfection of a machine over the vulnerability of a human soul remained. And so, we are left with the chilling final truth. The Bourbon dynasty's moral decay was not what caused its downfall. Its downfall was caused by the success of its cover-up. The perfect, machine-like cruelty it enforced became the very flaw that made the monarchy incapable of surviving the age of human feeling. We return now to the stillness of this moment, imagining the quiet, hidden vault, sensing the metallic ghost of that unblinking mechanical heir. The light is dim, the air is still. The clockwork has stopped, but the rhythm of the lie echoes through history. The truth lies waiting. Just beneath the surface of the official record. And tonight, as the quiet settles around you, you may find yourself wondering about the nature of the perfect performance. and whether the history we believe to be true is simply the best constructed lie. The silence is deep now. May your mind find the quiet stillness. We peer into the heart of the Bourbon court, not at their battles or their treaties, but at the chilling psychological cost of their vanity. The kings of France lived under a curse of their own making, the relentless demand for physical perfection. They believed their divine right required a flawless body, a sculpted image that could never betray weakness. This obsession led to a dynastic betrayal that few historians dare to acknowledge. The constant intermarriage, meant to secure power, concentrated a horrific genetic flaw, hidden vulnerability. To conceal this shame, they embraced the forbidden solution. They would no longer rely on God or biology. Instead, they manufactured their future. They created mechanical substitutes, perfect in ivory and brass, and forced the entire court to accept this lie. The burden on the Bourbon heir was not just the crown, but the impossible task of outshining his own silent and flawlessly engineered replacement. This is the buried truth of perfection achieved through deception. This is the truth the king buried ... Now, let us turn back the pages to a time when majesty was not just a title, but a physical demonstration of God's favor. We leave the clamor of the court and move into the silent, private chambers where the mirrors are tall and unforgiving. Here, the true power of the king was measured not in armies, but in the straightness of his posture, the steadiness of his gaze, and the beauty of his children. The air in these rooms is heavy with expectation, fear, and a deep, agonizing pressure. We seek the origin of the impossible standard, the mandate of physical perfection that broke the dynasty. Before the first revolution even began, the idea of the perfect king evolved rapidly under the Sun King. Louis XIV, he was a master of spectacle, carefully curating his own image until it became almost divine. Every portrait, every statue, every public appearance was a meticulously staged ritual designed to prove that he was not merely a man, but the embodiment of France's golden age. This political strategy, however, had a devastating unintended consequence. It established physical perfection as a prerequisite for legitimacy for his successors. The standard was not merely to be strong, but to be flawlessly, visibly chosen. Any physical anomaly, any illness, or any perceived weakness was seen not as a medical problem, but as a political crisis, a subtle message from heaven that favor was being withdrawn. The pressure began the moment a royal child was conceived. The pregnancy of a queen was not a private affair. It was a state function, monitored by physicians and courtiers whose anxiety intensified with every passing month. They were not hoping for a healthy child. They were praying for a perfect symbol, and yet, within the hallowed, shielded walls of Versailles, the truth of biology was unavoidable. The relentless pursuit of dynastic security through political marriage, cousin marrying cousin, and then marrying their own cousins from related houses across Europe, was quietly concentrating a rare, debilitating genetic fragility within the Bourbon line. It was an invisible curse, one that could lie dormant for a generation, only to surface suddenly and shatter the illusion of divine perfection. This flaw manifested most cruelly in neurological and skeletal degeneration, crippling the bodies and sometimes the minds of the royal children. The afflicted child was living proof that the perfection the dynasty claimed was nothing but a fragile, temporary lie. The moment the first symptoms were detected in an heir was the moment the moral decay began to accelerate. The king and queen, terrified of the political fallout, faced an impossible choice: publicly acknowledge a flaw that would undermine their absolute authority, or conceal a devastating truth that would require monumental, continuous deception. They chose the deception. The first step in this agonizing process was the creation of the Office of Succession Surveillance, a highly secretive branch of the court physician's office, whose only true purpose was to identify the flaw and manage the ensuing cover-up. The chief surveillance physician was given absolute chilling power. His diagnosis determined whether the child would live a life of glittering public service or one of profound, shameful isolation. The heir who showed the flaw was instantly isolated. He was not cast out, but carefully, quietly removed from the public narrative. Official records detailing his life ceased. He became a ghost within his own palace, transferred to the chambers des ombres not as a prisoner of state, but as a prisoner of biology. His entire existence was dedicated to being forgotten, even by his own servants. The isolation of the true, imperfect heir was a necessary prerequisite for the lie of the mechanical heir, for the illusion to be effective. The real prince had to vanish without a trace, leaving the public slate clean for the perfect substitute. This act, more than any other, reveals the moral bankruptcy of the mandate of perfection. They sacrificed the emotional and psychological well-being of their own child for the stability of an image. Imagine the psychological landscape of the sequestered prince. He was surrounded by luxury, yet entirely alone. He heard the muffled sounds of celebrations, the trumpets announcing his own supposed presence at state events, yet he knew he was nowhere near them. He was haunted by his own substitute, a silent, perfect mirror image that paraded in the sun while he wasted away in shadow. Meanwhile, the court was subtly prepared for the change. The physicians began to circulate careful, vague diagnosis stories of a delicate constitution, a need for quiet recovery, or a temporary retreat to the country. The narratives were crafted to manage expectation, conditioning the public to the idea that the heir was precious and fragile, softening the ground for the eventual introduction of the robust, perfectly presented mechanical double. The king and queen were the central performers in this relentless, lifelong drama. They perfected the art of the distracted parent giving the public heir attention only when absolutely necessary, to avoid the risk of their true feelings or lack thereof showing through. When the mechanical prince was finally ready for his public debut, the royal family transitioned from parental love to professional ownership. The appearance of the mechanical heir was a triumph of the forbidden's knowledge. The sight of a prince who moved with such perfect, reserved dignity, who never tired, never faltered, and never showed the slightest sign of the inherited weakness. Greeted with relief and adoration, the public perception confirmed the king's darkest belief that his power was indeed tied to flawlessness, and that the perfection of the machine was superior to the flawed nature of the human. The very air in Versailles shifted. Courtiers began to unconsciously imitate the stillness of the mechanical heir. It became fashionable to adopt a reserved, almost rigid posture, to speak in measured, unemotional tones, and to avoid the vulgarity of spontaneous laughter or tears. The perfect stillness of the automaton, born of its mechanical constraints, became the new, unspoken standard of French nobility. This imitation wasn't just aesthetic, it was psychological. The noble class, sensing where the true power lay, adopted the emotional repression of the machine. They became less human, more ceremonial. The soul of the court began to wither under the icy pressure of this mandate of physical perfection. Dr. Dubois, the aging court physician, meticulously catalogued this cultural shift. His journals describe the chilling reality. The automaton has not merely replaced the prince, it has replaced the spirit of the court. We are no longer governed by men of passion, but by men who strive to be as perfectly, predictably cold as the brass heart of the replacement. He wrote of the terror of the young noblemen who suddenly found themselves under immense pressure to conceal their own minor physical imperfections, a limp, a tremor, or even an overly expressive face. The mandate of perfection had expanded beyond the royal bloodline. It had become the standard for the entire aristocracy. Fear of discovery. The fear of the mechanical prince faltering in public became an ambient, constant presence in the palace. It was a secret woven into the very fabric of daily life. Every guard, every servant, every person in the proximity of the heir was a potential vulnerability. This pervasive fear led to another layer of moral decay, the institutionalization of cruelty to maintain secrecy. The security measures surrounding the chambers des ombres and the artisans within it were absolute. The families of the secret artificers were moved to secure royal residences, essentially becoming hostages of the crown. They were given comfort and luxury, but they were cut off from communication. Their purpose was to guarantee the artificers' silence and compliance. The artificers themselves, The brilliant minds who perfected the anatomy of the lie were subjected to profound psychological control. They were kept in a state of perpetual debt to the crown, a continuous exchange of extraordinary wealth and comfort for absolute, personal freedom. They were rewarded greatly, but they were never allowed to leave the specialized workshops. They were, in the most literal sense, prisoners of their own genius. The mandate of perfection demanded this sustained systemic abuse of power. The king could not tolerate a world where his security depended on the fickle loyalty of mere men. He needed absolute, programmed obedience, and he achieved it through this complex structure of isolation. Fear and bribery. The true isolated prince, meanwhile, became the living representation of the dynasty's shame. He was used by the surveillance physicians as a grotesque control experiment, constant measure of the genetic flaw that the automaton was designed to overcome. His decline was documented, but never treated with the zeal or resources poured into the mechanical maintenance of the replacement. Imagine the young, true heir, sitting in his silent room, sometimes brought a new doll or toy, only to realize that the accompanying guard was measuring his reaction time, comparing his hand tremor against the perfect stillness of the latest mechanical prototype being refined across the palace. His life was not his own. It was a negative space defining the boundary of the lie. The king, in his private moments of reflection, must have wrestled with the sin. Yet the pressure of the mandate, the crushing weight of maintaining the perception of divine right always won. The throne demanded perfection, and the king felt justified in sacrificing his child's humanity to provide it. The psychological impact on the royal couple was devastating. They were forced to perform deep, abiding love for a machine, while suppressing all public acknowledgement of their true, suffering son. This created an emotional inversion. The synthetic relationship became the dominant reality, while the real one withered in the shadow of neglect. The king and queen essentially forgot how to be real parents. The emotional cost paid by the king and queen was manifested in increasing detachment and coldness toward all matters of state and family. Their personal moral decay became the template for their governance. If they could lie so profoundly about the life of their own child, what was the value of truth in international diplomacy or domestic law? The answer for them was zero. The lie of the heir created a cascade of institutional dishonesty. The mandate of perfection did not just demand a flawless heir. It demanded a flawless government built around him. The consequence was a bureaucracy that prioritized image over substance, secrecy over efficiency, and cruel control over merciful governance. We can see the subtle echoes of this mandate in the stiff, elaborate clothing of the court, the impossibly high collars, the rigid corsets, the layered silk and velvet designed not just for beauty, but for concealment. These clothes were a form of armor designed to hide the natural, flawed movements of the human body, forcing the courtiers into the same unnaturally controlled posture as the automaton they secretly served. Every buckle, every ribbon, every inch of lace was a silent tribute to the mechanical prince. The fear reached its highest point during state occasions, specifically the Grand Parade. This event required the mechanical prince to travel a significant distance, exposed to thousands of eyes and the harsh, uncontrolled elements of the outdoor environment. The artificers and the Black Guard would monitor the weather for weeks, adjusting the oil viscosity and the tension springs within the automaton in anticipation of temperature and humidity changes. A simple change in the morning fog could cause a fatal hitch in the clockwork. Heirs gate a failure that would be impossible to explain away. The procession itself was choreographed to the millimeter. The speed of the carriage, the placement of the royal attendants, who were actually handlers, and the selection of the route were all determined by the needs of the machine, not the comfort of the public. Every movement was a risk analysis. Imagine the anxiety that must have permeated the king's carriage as he watched the mechanical prince, seated rigid and perfect in the seat of honor. The king was not watching for expressions of love from his people. He was listening obsessively for the single, tiny whir that might betray the deception. His heart, perhaps, beat faster than the hidden clockwork that powered the prince's arm. This anxiety bred profound paranoia. Anyone seen staring too intensely at the prince, anyone who whispered or pointed with an unusual fixation, was marked by the Black Guard. They were not arrested immediately. They were simply monitored, their names entered into a hidden ledger of suspicion, the register of the knowers. The king needed to know who suspected the truth. Even if they never dared to speak it, the mandate of perfection thus metastasized, turning the king into the chief spy of his own court, obsessed with rooting out any hint of the forbidden's knowledge. He ruled not through love or respect, but through the continuous maintenance of an impossible, heartless illusion. His isolation from his own family was mirrored by his isolation from his people, all thanks to the cold, perfect silence of the clockwork child. The psychological effect on the surviving true heir, Louis, after the death of the mechanical prince and his subsequent elevation to public life, was the final, tragic fulfillment of the mandate. Louis was now faced with the impossible task of filling the emotional void left by a machine that had set an unreachable standard. The court, having been conditioned to the unnerving stillness and reserved nature of the automaton, found the real boy with his human anxieties, his occasional tremors, and his genuine need for affection to be unsettling. They were used to the idea of perfection, not the reality of imperfection. His tutors were instructed to suppress his natural childhood curiosity and his artistic inclinations, forcing him instead to study the dry mathematics and predictable logic that governed the clockwork mechanisms themselves. The king believed that if Louis internalized the spirit of the automaton order, logic, and emotionless precision, he might yet survive the mandate. The true prince's childhood became a slow, agonizing process of self-betrayal. He was forced to reject his own humanity to fulfill the needs of the crown. He learned to flatten his voice, to restrict his gestures, and to replace spontaneous thought with carefully rehearsed, predictable pronouncements. He was being programmed by his parents to become a psychological automaton. This internal conflict had severe consequences for the young ruler. Historians often speak of the Bourbons' later apathy and indecision, their inability to connect with the suffering of the common people. This psychological distance was not an accident of character. It was the direct result of the mandate of physical perfection. The process of becoming a king required Louis to first dehumanize himself, to become cold and rigid to satisfy the ghost of the perfect machine. The cost of perfection, it turns out, is empathy. The great irony is that the secrecy of the automaton created a new vulnerability for the dynasty. Since the mechanical prince had never spoken without a script, the public expected the real prince to also be a man of few, careful words. When, in later life, King Louis eventually tried to show genuine emotion or communicate openly, the court dismissed it as weakness or instability. He was unable to break the emotional pattern established by his mechanical predecessor. His every attempt at genuine reform or compassionate governance was undermined by the collective, subconscious expectation that he should be perfectly, flawlessly still. The silent, mechanical perfection of the lie had become the inescapable reality of the throne, the forbiddance. Knowledge of the clockwork prince was literally woven into the personality of the king. He was a man consumed by the ghost of a machine. The final, devastating psychological consequence of the mandate of perfection was the king's inability to truly trust anyone. If his own parents had orchestrated such a monumental, heartless lie, how could he trust a courtier, a minister, or a general? The world became a shifting landscape of artifice and performance. Every smile, every compliment, every declaration of loyalty was suspect. He began to view his entire existence through the lens of the mechanical deception. He saw flaws in everyone, not because they were genuinely dishonest, but because they failed to meet the flawless, non-human standards set by the automaton. This intense paranoia led to political paralysis. The king was often indecisive, unwilling to commit to a course of action because he believed any counselor who advised him was merely performing a scripted role. Just as the artificers had programmed the mechanical heir, he was trapped in a perpetual psychological loop, constantly listening for the faint, betraying whir of human self-interest beneath the smooth veneer of courtly elegance. This is the ultimate, profound moral decay of the mandate of perfection. It destroyed the capacity for genuine, human connection at the very peak of state power. The king was a figure of total authority, yet he was utterly, miserably alone, isolated by the lie created to protect him. Historians search for clear, political causes for the French monarchy's decline. They speak of war, debt, and famine, but they often miss the subtle, internal decay that made the monarchy incapable of responding to these crises. The true weakness was psychological, a sovereign who could not tell the difference between a real, suffering human being and a flawless, unfeeling machine. The ultimate symbol of this paralysis was the archives of the forgotten. Louis, inheriting his father's obsessive paranoia, continued to visit the vault containing the blueprints. He wasn't seeking knowledge. He was seeking certainty. He would study the detailed plans, marveling at the flawless, measurable precision of the mechanism, contrasting it with the chaotic, unpredictable, and flawed nature of his own kingdom. The perfection of the machine became a terrifying, beautiful siren song for the king. It represented the order and absolute control that his messy, human kingdom desperately lacked. He yearned for the cold, predictable precision of clockwork rule. This quiet obsession ensured that the spirit of the automaton remained the true, unseen ruler of France. The mandate of perfection was fulfilled not by creating an external flawless appearance, but by enforcing an internal, psychological state of mechanical coldness upon the sovereign himself. The silence that surrounded the throne was not reverence. It was the deep, unsettling quiet of a mechanism waiting to fail. And so, we must reflect on the terrible price of seeking flawlessness in the realm of human power. The Bourbon kings demanded perfection in the physical form of their heir, believing that the immaculate body was proof of their divine, unquestionable authority. To preserve this lie, they traded the humanity of their own blood for the cold precision of engineered brass and ivory. The unbearable burden on the Bourbon heir was not merely the crown, but the crushing, psychological weight of a mechanical ghost that constantly reminded him that his own, living, breathing form was judged to be a failure. The resulting moral decay was an institutionalized cruelty that slowly stripped the dynasty of its soul, leaving behind a beautiful, rigid shell that was utterly incapable of bending to the winds of human change. The final question remains, hanging in the candlelit air. If a ruler chooses the perfect, predictable mechanism over the chaotic, vulnerable reality of a human being, can that kingdom ever truly be governed by compassion? Or is it destined, like the clockwork prince itself, to run its scripted course until the final, inevitable tension spring breaks? The silence deepens now, and we move closer to the terrifying truth of the slow corruption. The truth about the slow corruption of the royal flesh, the genetic curse. May the quiet stillness settle around you, beneath the flawless, gilded surfaces of the Bourbon court. A terrifying truth was slowly taking root. The royal bloodline, purified and protected by generations of strategic in-marriage, carried within it not divine strength but a devastating curse. This genetic flaw was the ultimate betrayal of the dynasty's claims to perfection, a shameful secret that threatened to rot the House of France from the inside out. It was a physical manifestation of moral hubris, forcing the monarchy to commit an act of forbidden science. To prevent this slow decay from becoming public, the king authorized the construction of a perfect, inhuman double a mechanical heir designed to lie for the bloodline. They buried the truth of biology in a hidden chamber and replaced it with a flawless machine, choosing artifice over agonizing reality. This is the buried knowledge of a failing bloodline. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages to the quiet horror of inheritance. The light is soft, filtered through aged velvet curtains. We are in the most protected, most private chambers of the palace, where political maneuvering gives way to the immutable laws of nature. We are seeking the origin of the corruption, the small, hidden flaw that became the fulcrum for the entire deception. We must look closely at the beautiful, fragile thing that is the royal body. understanding that for the Bourbons, genetics was destiny, and physical flaw was treason. The great European royal houses were not merely families. They were systems of interconnected power, bound together by treaties and secured by marriage. The Bourbons, like the Habsburgs, pursued the ideal of the pure line marrying within a tight, carefully selected circle of related dynasties to ensure that wealth, territory, and influence never left the grasp of the few. This practice was considered the pinnacle of statecraft, the most powerful tool for ensuring perpetual peace and control, but every purity comes at a price. Unbeknownst to the glittering monarchs, this tight concentration of shared genes was also concentrating vulnerability. The genetic flaw was subtle at first, a weakness in the joints, a tremor in the hands, or an unusual fragility of the teeth. These minor afflictions were easily dismissed as the price of high birth. Treated by expensive foreign remedies and swiftly forgotten by the public, however, as the generations passed and the pattern of intermarriage intensified, the flaw began to manifest with terrifying clarity in specific crippling forms. It was not always present, but when it struck, it was devastating. It often targeted the nervous system, leading to a loss of motor control, chronic tremors, and, in the worst cases, a profound mental and physical regression that rendered the heir incapable of public function, or even basic self-care. This was the slow corruption of the royal flesh. It was a silent, internal enemy that could not be defeated by armies, treaties, or the lavish wealth of the kingdom. It was the ultimate contradiction of the divine right of biological proof that the blood chosen by God was, in fact, failing. The detection of this flaw in an heir created a crisis of faith and state. The king was suddenly faced with a reality he could not conquer. If his successor was physically diminished, the image of the perfect, God-chosen dynasty would shatter, potentially inciting rebellion or inviting invasion from surrounding, watchful powers. The flaw in the flesh was a flaw in the entire structure of the state. The shame was not merely personal, it was institutional. To admit to the flaw was to admit that the entire centuries-long strategy of royal marriage, the very foundation of their power, was fundamentally flawed. It was easier to commit the ultimate deception than to acknowledge the ultimate biological truth. This profound psychological pressure explains the king's willingness to embrace the forbidden knowledge of the artificers. He was not commissioning a machine out of cruelty, but out of a desperate need to find a flawless solution to a biological problem that mocked his absolute power. He chose the certainty of engineering over the chaos of human genetics. The initial response to the manifestation of the flaw was not treatment, but concealment. The afflicted prince was moved to increasingly remote chambers, shielded from the eyes of all but a trusted few. His life became a slow descent into darkness, marked by the constant, agonizing awareness that his existence was a state secret. The concealment required a network of loyal attendants, all sworn to a blood oath of silence, a hidden cadre of servants whose primary duty was to erase the true heir's presence from the palace's daily life. They became specialists in the art of the near miss, guiding other servants away from the hidden wing, creating false sounds to mask the distress of the prince, and ensuring that any discarded object that might reveal the prince's condition was instantly incinerated. This imposed secrecy created an atmosphere of deep paranoia within the king's inner circle. They were surrounded by opulence, yet constantly stalked by the fear of a misplaced word, a curious glance, or a whisper that could unravel the entire structure of the state. The palace, magnificent in its appearance, was fundamentally unstable, balanced precariously on the failing health of one small boy. The afflicted heir became the subject of Dr. Dubois's most confidential research. Dubois's objective was not to cure, but to document. He was a historian of the decay, mapping the progression of the genetic flaw with chilling precision. His journal entries read like a lament for the perfection that was promised but never delivered. He analyzed the prince's bone structure, his neurological responses, and the rate of his physical regression, using the data to inform the artificers on how to design the mechanical double to avoid these precise symptoms. The automaton was, in essence, A masterpiece of negative engineering, a perfect lie designed against the measurable truth of the genetic curse, the constant comparison between the living, suffering child and the cold, inanimate blueprint became the source of the king's deepest moral decay. He saw the flaws in his son, the tremors, the fatigue, the unpredictable weakness, and contrasted them with the flawless, measurable strength of the machine's design. In his mind, the machine was already the better, stronger heir. This realization led to the ultimate betrayal of fatherhood. The king began to view his true son not as a child to be loved, but as a political liability to be contained. His true affection, or at least his deepest professional respect, shifted entirely toward the secret artificers, the men who could manufacture the perfection that biology had so cruelly denied him. The queen, too, suffered an agonizing psychological divorce from reality. She was forced to maintain the image of the perfect royal mother, grieving, yet stoic while enduring the slow, silent corruption of her actual child. Her public tears were for the idea of a perfect heir. Her private, internal agony was for the shame of the biological failure, the genetic flaw. Therefore, did not merely attack the flesh of the prince. It attacked the soul of the royal family. It replaced genuine parental love with cold, obsessive statecraft and honest grief with elaborate public performance. The moral corruption was a direct reflection of the physical corruption they fought so desperately to hide. The fear of the flaw was so profound that it affected future marriage negotiations. Every potential future queen was scrutinized by the surveillance office, not for her political alliances, but for the subtle, physical perfection of her family line, searching for any hint of the shameful genetic flaw that might resurface in the next generation. The focus of the dynasty shifted from conquering foreign lands to conquering their own blood. This continuous, exhausting battle against their own biology became the hidden, relentless engine of the Bourbon court, driving their secrecy, their paranoia, and their eventual decision to commit the ultimate sin of creating a mechanical god. The pressure on the queen to produce a flawless heir was, perhaps, the most profound cruelty of the mandate. After the afflicted prince was concealed, the expectation was that she would immediately conceive a second, perfect child to secure the succession. Her body was viewed not as a vessel of love, but as a flawed factory that needed to produce an unblemished product. The methods employed by the court to try and purify the queen's subsequent pregnancies were steeped in superstition and desperate, unproven remedies. Alchemists were consulted, strange tinctures were consumed, and obscure religious rites were performed, all in the desperate hope that sheer willpower and political necessity could somehow override the immutable laws of heredity. This period was marked by extraordinary psychological abuse, cloaked in the guise of medical care. The queen was constantly reminded that the genetic curse was a stain, and that its recurrence would be seen as her personal failure, regardless of the centuries of inbreeding that caused it. This shame was an instrument of control, ensuring her total compliance with the lie of the mechanical heir. The shame was extended to the entire aristocracy. The noble families who had participated in the complex web of royal marriage began to look inward, scrutinizing their own children for signs of the flaw. This led to a wave of hidden private cruelties, children being isolated, sequestered, or even sent away to distant estates merely for showing a slight lisp, a nervous tic, or an unusual clumsiness. The mandate of perfection had created a culture of paranoia where even minor human frailty was judged as a high-stakes political risk. The historian, when looking at the portraits of this era, sees a fascinating contrast. The faces are impossibly pale, the expressions unnervingly composed, the bodice stiffly encased in elaborate structured clothing. This visual rigidity was not merely fashion. It was a defense mechanism. It was an aesthetic response to the threat of the slow corruption of the royal flesh, an attempt to project an outer perfection that masked the internal biological failure. The clothing was an emotional armor against the terrifying possibility of betrayal by one's own body. The king's relationship with the mechanical prince was initially pragmatic, but it slowly evolved into something akin to reverence. He saw the automaton as the conqueror of the genetic curse, the forbidden solution that had defeated biology. He preferred the quiet, predictable maintenance of the brass joints to the terrifying, unpredictable decay of the human body. This preference cemented the moral decay of the crown. The king's emotional capacity was inverted. He loved the machine for its perfection, and feared his own son for his imperfection. He found peace in the inanimate, and only anxiety in the living. This cold, calculated love for the perfect lie was the true beginning of the dynasty's end. Imagine the secret meetings between the king and the chief artificer. They would speak not of strategy or war, but of material science and internal stresses. The artificer, in his descriptions of the automaton's perfect, hidden machinery, offered the king a temporary escape from the chaotic reality of his own flawed bloodline. The workshop became a perverse sanctuary where perfection was possible, purchased at the cost of one human soul. The artificers, with their hands-on knowledge of the flaw, became the only true confidants of the king's deepest secret. They were privy to the truth of the royal body in a way that no courtier or even priest was. They saw the detailed clinical measurements of the afflicted prince, and they transposed those exact failures into the successful, flawless geometry of the automaton. Their unique expertise was a form of forbidden knowledge that gave them an unsettling power over the crown. The king, in turn, showered them with wealth and protection, knowing that their silence was the single most valuable asset in the entire kingdom. He protected them fiercely from the jealous eyes of the nobility, who wondered why these common artisans held such an unusual degree of favor and access. The details of the genetic flaw, as documented by Dr. Dubois, were chillingly precise. The flaw often manifested first in the prince's gait, a subtle, almost imperceptible shuffling or unevenness. This was the first sign of the slow corruption. It was the initial crack in the perfect facade, demanding the intervention of the artificers, tasked with replicating the natural movement of a human, developed a hidden gyroscope system within the automaton's core. This was a marvel of early engineering, designed to instantly correct any deviation from the center of gravity, thus ensuring a perpetually smooth, perfect stride. The mechanical prince walked with a flawless, unnatural majesty, a walk so perfect that the court simply registered it as the ultimate expression of royal grace. The king, watching the automaton glide through the halls, felt a sense of relief that was profoundly corrupting. He had defeated the weakness of the flesh through the strength of metal. He had replaced the unpredictable failure of biology with the certain success of mathematics. This preference for the mechanical certainty over the human chaos led to a chilling shift in the king's political philosophy. He began to demand this same absolute, predictable perfection in all matters of state. He sought ministers who were utterly emotionless, treaties that were geometrically balanced, and laws that were applied with the rigid, unbending force of a machine. The moral decay had now moved beyond the family and infected the apparatus of the state. The ideal ruler in the king's mind was no longer a compassionate shepherd, but a perfectly calibrated clockmaker, ensuring every gear of the nation turned with flawless precision. The subtle, underlying tension created by the secret knowledge was omnipresent. Every tremor in the king's hand, every moment of fatigue he experienced, was a terrifying reminder of the shameful genetic flaw he had fought so hard to conceal in his son. He was constantly afraid that the corruption was infectious, and that his own body would be the next to betray the perfection of the throne. The pressure cooker environment created by this secret meant that no expression of genuine feeling was safe. When the queen wept, it was assumed she was performing for the court. When the king showed quiet rage, it was assumed he was covering up some new sign of the genetic curse. Authenticity was dead, murdered by the mandate of perfection. The most poignant victim of this corruption was the prince himself, the true heir, sequestered in his silent chambers. He was denied the basic dignity of his pain. His suffering was viewed not as a human condition, but as a political liability. The king's coldness towards him was not personal malice, but the desperate self-preservation of a monarch, whose entire legacy rested on ignoring the truth of his son's failing body. The prince, sensing the truth of his isolation, developed a profound internal sense of betrayal. He knew that the warmth, the cheers, and the love of the court were directed toward a ghost of flawless, mechanical impostor. This knowledge gave him a chilling, premature wisdom. He understood that in the world of the Bourbon court, perfection was required, and his own existence was an inconvenience. The moral decay of the system demanded that the artificers continue their work in perpetual secrecy, refining the automaton even after it was publicly retired. The king, in his paranoia, commissioned several backup mechanical heirs, models built with the latest materials and mechanisms, each one slightly more perfect than the last. These unneeded replicas lay disassembled in the deepest vault, a cold, quiet army of substitutes, waiting for the next sign of biological failure in the royal nursery. The existence of these spare parts and silent replicas proves the ultimate truth of the king's sin. He had entirely lost faith in his bloodline. He had chosen the endless, predictable cycle of engineering over the natural, messy cycle of life and death. The crown was no longer an inheritance. It was a complex, self-sustaining machine. The shame of the genetic flaw became the unspoken, true religion of the Bourbon court. It dictated policy, controlled social behavior, and defined the emotional landscape of every person within the palace walls. It was the negative space that defined the entire empire. The physicians who helped cover up the flaw became the highest priests of this new religion of deception. They wielded the power of medical language to obfuscate the truth, issuing carefully worded pronouncements that managed the public's perception of the royal health. Their ability to lie with conviction was more valued than their ability to heal. This profound, continuous deception created a ruling class that was fundamentally detached from reality. They had grown accustomed to manufacturing their own truth, believing that any problem, no matter how profound, could be solved by a sufficient expenditure of secrecy, gold, and mechanical genius. They were experts at building illusions, but utterly incapable of managing reality. The shame of the slow corruption was, therefore, not just a biological curse, it was a political virus that slowly infected and ultimately destroyed the very soul of the monarchy. The moral decay caused by the shame intensified. After the first mechanical heir was publicly retired, the king was forced to present the true, frail prince to the world, claiming he was a distant, previously unknown relative, suddenly brought in to secure the line. This required the entire court to participate in a colossal, collective lie of forgetting. Everyone had to erase the memory of the robust, perfect mechanical child and accept the reality of the withdrawn, sickly boy. This act was psychologically damaging to the entire French aristocracy. They were asked to deny their own memories and senses, submitting their perception of reality to the political needs of the crown. The court became a silent theater where everyone was forced to play along with the absurd pretense. The most tragic consequence for the true prince was that he could never truly escape the shadow of the machine. The court's reaction to his genuine human frailty was marked by suspicion. When he trembled, they did not see a sick child. They saw the potential return of the shameful genetic flaw. When he spoke softly, they compared his voice to the faint, metallic cadence of the recorded automaton. He was constantly judged against the impossible standard of non-human perfection. He spent his childhood trying to imitate a machine, repressing his own lively spirit to fulfill the required level of royal stillness. This internal battle, the fight to extinguish his own vulnerability, was the final, quiet act of the slow corruption. The curse had moved from the body to the soul, forcing the king to become an emotional automaton himself. Dr. Dubos's final, desperate entries reflect on this moral horror. He realized that the mechanical prince had not solved the problem. It had merely amplified it. By creating a flawless lie, the king had made reality unacceptable. The forbidden knowledge had created a standard of perfection that no human could ever meet. The archives containing the artificer's plans were not simply records of technology. They were records of the king's desperate flight from biology. They were the blueprints of his self-betrayal, the tangible evidence of a soul that had chosen brass over blood, the genetic flaw, though hidden, dictated the rhythm of the court for generations. It ensured the perpetuation of secrecy, the isolation of the sovereign, and the profound moral decay of a dynasty that prioritized image above all else. We leave the king now, alone in his archive, surrounded by the blueprints of his flawless mechanical lie. The slow corruption of the royal flesh was the invisible enemy that forced the powerful House of Bourbon to its knees. It proved that no amount of gold, power, or political strategy can defeat the truth hidden in the very essence of life. The shame of their genetics led to the sin of their science, and that sin defined the chilling, emotionless nature of their rule. The final, soft truth we carry into the silence is that the ultimate corruption of the royal house was not physical, but moral. They chose the cold, predictable certainty of the machine over the chaotic, vulnerable beauty of the human soul. And the empire paid the price for their impossible demand for perfection. The dripping continues in the silent chambers, a constant, quiet reminder of the flaw that could not be concealed, and that flaw brings us directly to the source of the solution. The creation of the ultimate deception? The chamber of the secret artificer, a guild of caged geniuses. May the quiet stillness settle around you. The darkest secret of the Bourbon monarchy was not a political maneuver, but a profound ethical betrayal committed against its most gifted minds. When the royal bloodline failed, the king turned to a source of forbidden knowledge, the genius of Europe's greatest watchmakers and automata builders. These masters of mechanism were not hired. They were abducted, isolated, and permanently imprisoned in a hidden wing of Versailles known as the Chambers des Ombres. Their mission, to build the ultimate Laia, flawlessly engineered, clockwork prince to replace the true, afflicted heir. This was the birth of the Guild of Caged Geniuses, forced to use their art to commit the ultimate historical fraud. They traded their freedom for the creation of perfect, silent deception, and their genius became the cornerstone of the king's curse. This is the truth the king buried. Now, we must leave the gilded halls and descend into the cold, silent depths of the palace, the hidden workshops that held the key to the king's desperate stability. The air here is thick with the scent of fine oil, polished brass, and the faint, metallic tang of regret. We are searching for the secret artificers, the guild of imprisoned minds whose hands created the perfect body of the lie. Imagine their quiet desperation, their genius harnessed for a monstrous anti-human purpose. We seek the chamber where human skill was turned into the ultimate act of historical forgery, the genesis of the Chambre des Ombres, the chambers of shadow, was rooted in the king's absolute faith in mechanism over biology. When the genetic flaw manifested in the heir, the king, advised by a disgraced but brilliant engineer, decided that if nature failed, science must be forced to succeed. The task was deemed too sensitive, too blasphemous to entrust to court physicians or local tradesmen. It required a unique concentration of expertise. The artificers were selected based on two criteria: their unparalleled, innovative skill in human-scale clockwork, and their extreme isolation from political power or family ties. They were sought in the obscure workshops of Prague, the hidden laboratories of Florence, and the disciplined clock towers of Switzerland. They were men who spoke the silent, precise language of gears and levers. Their recruitment was not a negotiation. It was an act of state kidnapping, executed with terrifying efficiency by the king's black guard. Each artificer simply vanished from his life, no notes. No ransoms, no evidence of struggle. They were brought in black carriages under perpetual guard, their faces hooded until they reached the hidden, subterranean wing of Versailles. Upon arrival, they were not immediately put to work. They were given a tour, a chilling induction into their new reality. They were shown the opulence they would be denied, and then, most crucially, they were shown the affliction of the true prince-a-brief, terrifying glimpse of the genetic curse that their genius was meant to conquer. The message was clear: your work is not merely mechanical. It is the savior of the dynasty. The chamber of the secret artificer was a masterpiece of concealed engineering itself. It was soundproofed with layers of heavy cork and velvet, ensuring that the continuous sounds of filing, hammering, and the tiny whirring of testing mechanisms never reached the rest of the palace. It contained every conceivable tool, every necessary metal, and an endless supply of high-grade oils and precious woods. It was a golden cage designed for productivity, but they were prisoners. Their existence was marked by two rigid rules: never leave the chamber and never speak of the true nature of the work. Their collective talent was immediately focused on the problem of anatomical forgery. This was the forbidden knowledge they were forced to perfect. It involved translating the soft, unpredictable movements of the human body into the measurable, predictable physics of a clockwork mechanism. They began by studying the detailed sketches provided by the surveillance physician, the exact angles of a royal bow, the precise distance a foot travels in a step, the infinitesimal tremor in a 5-year-old hand, the lead artificer, a severe, meticulous Swiss named Master Emile, quickly realized the profound difference between building a moving figure and building a convincing lie. A figure can walk, a lie must breathe. The artificers were faced with mechanical problems that required unprecedented solutions. How to replicate the natural distribution of weight in a small child? They solved this by creating a core skeleton of highly polished, lightweight steel alloy, precisely counterweighted with hidden lead discs inside the ankles and hips to achieve a natural, balanced gait that could fool even a mother's eye. How to replicate the texture and warmth of living skin. This was perhaps the greatest physical challenge and the source of the most intense secret labor. They worked with fine layers of tanned calf skin, impregnated with a unique blend of beeswax and specialized organic oils. The skin was applied in almost microscopic layers, slowly built up and treated until it held a soft, living luminescence under candlelight. The finished product was uncanny, almost repulsive in its perfect simulation of life. The artificers were, in a sense, forced to commit a continuous act of blasphemy. They were attempting to replicate the sacred mechanism of life itself, using only metal and wood. This work was a source of deep, silent moral conflict for the guild. Many of these men were profoundly religious, and they knew that creating a counterfeit human was an offense to their god. Master Emile's journal, kept hidden beneath a false floor in his workshop, speaks of this moral decay. He wrote, "We build not a puppet but a lie, and every perfectly carved finger, every silent gear, is a betrayal of the living soul. I pray that the perfection we achieve here is not mistaken for divine favor. For this work comes only from terror." Their isolation became a tool for the king by cutting them off from the outside world. He eliminated distractions and ensured that their entire waking focus was on the project. Their genius, once scattered across Europe and applied to clocks and philosophical instruments, was now consolidated and hyper-focused on one singular, terrifying goal: the perfect, silent deception of the heir. The work was relentless. A small failure in a single brass rivet could require weeks of redesign, as the structural integrity of the entire automaton was interconnected. They worked by the dim, controlled light of heavy brass lamps, which were monitored to ensure no unexpected shadows or flares could betray the location of the chamber. The king would occasionally visit, accompanied only by the head of the Black Guard and Dr. Dubois. These visits were filled with oppressive silence. The king never offered praise or comfort. He merely scrutinized the work, comparing the emerging mechanisms against his clear, desperate vision of flawless succession. He treated the artificers not as men, but as highly complex, essential tools. The artificers learned to communicate only through technical drawings and hushed, mechanical terminology. They spoke in the language of torque, tension, and friction, knowing that emotion was a vulnerability that could cost them their lives. They became a guild of caged geniuses, their intellect sharp and their spirits slowly dulled by the cold. Metallic nature of their perpetual task. One of the most delicate and time-consuming tasks within the chamber was perfecting the hands of the heir. A human hand is a marvel of flexibility and warmth. The automaton's hands, made of carved ivory and multiple articulating joints, needed to be able to perform small, necessary gestures, resting elegantly on a surface, accepting a ritualistic offering, or, most critically, holding a pen to sign a document. The artificers spent months refining the finger mechanisms, creating miniature clockwork systems within the wrist that allowed for a fluid, subtle rotation, a movement that would allow the mechanical prints to appear relaxed rather than stiffly rigid. This required a level of microscopic precision never before seen in European engineering. The creation of the automaton was not just a marvel of engineering. It was a profound act of psychological infiltration. The artificers, forced to study the true prince's movements from a distance, had to become masters of behavioral mimicry. They studied the breathing patterns, the slight head tilts, and the unique, hesitant blink of the royal line, translating these human imperfections into programmed, repeatable motions. It was during this phase of intense observation that the artificers stumbled upon a terrifying, hidden truth about the genetic flaw. They realized through analyzing Dr. Dubois's copious notes that the flaw was not merely physical. It carried a subtle behavioral component, a profound melancholy or deep sense of withdrawal that seemed to infect the royal personality alongside the physical symptoms. This meant the mechanical heir couldn't just move perfectly. It had to move sadly. It had to carry the appropriate weight of royal reserve, the very emotional distance that the true prince's condition had naturally fostered. The artificers were forced to program an emotional state into the mechanisms, crafting a machine that expressed the very psychological isolation that the Bourbon court valued as dignity. The lead artificer, Emile, records his profound distress at this realization. "We were asked to save the dynasty from a failing body," he wrote, "but now we are asked to conquer the soul. To make the machine perfect, we must program it with the precise measure of unhappiness expected of a king." This demanded a new level of complex clockwork mechanisms that controlled the subtle, slow droop of the shoulders and the precisely measured movement of the head that suggested deep, solemn thought. They were creating a machine of perfect melancholy. The king, upon seeing the final, perfect result, the automaton displaying a silent, profound royal reserve, was finally satisfied. He saw not a machine, but the flawless, ideal king that nature had denied him. His moral decay was now total. He had chosen the programmed sorrow of a mechanism over the fragile, messy life of his son. The constant, isolated labor within the Chambre des Ombres took a heavy toll on the artificers. Their lives were reduced to the metallic, repetitive rhythm of their work. They slept in tiny cots adjacent to their benches, eating meals that were delivered through a secured, rotating dumbwaiter, never seeing the face of the person who fed them. Their world was defined by the four soundproofed walls and the intricate parts of the growing, mechanical prince. Their only contact with the outside world was the blackguard, the silent custodians of the lie. These guards were not typical soldiers. They were chosen for their loyalty, their discretion, and their absolute indifference to human suffering. Their role was to ensure that the artificers remained productive, silent, and most importantly, alive until the project was complete. The artificers understood that their value was entirely conditional. Once the automaton was finished and introduced to the court, their knowledge, the forbidden knowledge of how to build and maintain the deception, would instantly transform them from indispensable assets into lethal liabilities. Their genius was a double-edged sword. It gave them temporary power, but ensured their permanent imprisonment. This created a terrifying psychological atmosphere within the chamber. The artificers were driven by a desperate, shared need for perfection, knowing that their only hope for continued existence lay in the continuous maintenance and refinement of their creation. They were, quite literally, working for their next breath. The king's solution to their eventual threat was simple: perpetual service. They would not be killed upon completion. They would be maintained as a hidden essential resource. Their role would transition from creators to custodians. Their imprisonment was permanent, their freedom and impossibility. Master Emile recognized the subtle terror of this arrangement. He realized they had not just built a machine to fool the court. They had built a machine that would forever require them to live. Their genius had bound them to the life of the lie, forcing them to become eternal slaves to the very mechanisms they had Designed. His journal records this devastating realization. We built the machine to save the king, but the machine will now forever own us. We are not its masters. We are its internal human components. We are gears made of flesh and blood. The moral decay of the king was evident in this final, cold calculation. He had not only sacrificed his own son, but he had enslaved the most brilliant minds of his age, forcing them to live a quiet, metallic existence, forever separated from the world they had once enriched. The chamber of the secret artificer was not just a workshop. It was a cage for the soul. The artificers spent their final pre-launch weeks meticulously cataloging the automaton's design process known as the anatomy of the lie. Every hinge, every spring, every tension point was documented in complex, coded diagrams that only they could interpret. This was the true, ultimate forbidden knowledge, the operational manual for the king's deception. These blueprints were stored not in a general archive, but within a concealed cavity built into the very structure of the chamber itself, secured by 3 separate mechanical locks that required the combined expertise of Master Emile and 2 others to open. This was done to ensure that no single artificer could ever use the full knowledge as a bargaining chip. The guild was intentionally made dependent on its collective silence. The artificers also pioneered a system of silent maintenance. They developed tiny, custom-made instruments that allowed them to perform minute adjustments to the automaton's internal mechanisms, oiling the joints, tightening the wrist springs without ever removing the outer clothing or exposing the metal beneath the ivory skin. This allowed the mechanical heir to be maintained while sitting in a formal chair, seemingly resting during long, exhausting court functions. This ability to perform maintenance in plain sight was the ultimate proof of the artificer's genius and the king's total control. The mechanical heir was a masterpiece of continuous operation, sustained by the hidden, watchful eyes of its creators, who would subtly adjust a tension screw. Under the cover of straightening a velvet cuff, the psychological toll on the artificers, forced to witness their creation being mistaken for the true prince, was immense. They saw the public adoration, the international respect, and the familial pride directed at their handiwork, knowing the entire spectacle was a cold, precise fraud. They were the secret gods of the court, engineering every gesture of the ruling power. Yet they were eternally trapped in the darkness. This continuous moral pressure led some artificers to attempt minor acts of subtle rebellion. One master engraver, charged with crafting the tiny serial number onto the automaton's hidden internal spine, etched a symbol minuscule, upside down, crown, hoping that some future researcher might one day find this infinitesimal sign of betrayal. These small acts of defiance were the only way the Guild of Caged Geniuses could whisper their secret to history, the Chamber of the Secret. Artificer remains a chilling symbol of power corrupted by fear. It teaches us that the greatest minds, when pushed by absolute necessity and absolute cruelty, can create perfection, but only at the cost of their own and their sovereign's soul. The legacy of the Chamber's day Ambers extended far beyond the reign of the mechanical prince. Even after the automaton was retired, the chamber remained active. Its purpose shifted from creation to control. It became the hidden center for all technological surveillance and strategic deception used by the Bourbon Crown. The artificers, now aging, were forced to use their expertise to design complex lock mechanisms for treasury vaults, undetectable signaling devices for spies, and intricate surveillance mechanisms hidden within the very architecture of the palace. Their genius, born of the need for the mechanical heir, was now dedicated to perfecting the king's political paranoia. This was the final stage of the king's moral decay, turning the saving grace of forbidden knowledge into an instrument of perpetual domestic control. The artificers, the initial victims of the lie, became the willing, yet caged, perpetrators of the lie's continuation. The secrecy of their existence was absolute. When a member of the guild eventually died within the chamber, his passing was not recorded in any royal ledger. He was quietly interred in an unmarked plot on the palace grounds by the blackguard, and a replacement, a younger, equally brilliant but unconnected artisan was swiftly kidnapped and brought in to take his place, ensuring the continuity of the hidden expertise. The Guild of Caged Geniuses was maintained in perpetuity, their names interchangeable, their existence a permanent, essential shadow. The artificers were, in a sense, immortal not through their own bodies, but through the continuous force service of their successors. Their genius transcended death. Bound forever to the throne, they were never allowed to approach freely. The deepest philosophical question posed by the chamber is this: when is human ingenuity enslaved? Was it when the artificers were first abducted? Or was it the moment they decided to make the automaton perfectly sad? The moment they chose to sacrifice the truth of their own moral objections for the survival of their beautiful, terrible creation? The quiet answer echoes in the silent hum of the metal. True enslavement happens when genius is turned against the soul, the moral weight of the king's choice. The heavy silence of the artificer's prison and the meticulous perfection of the mechanical deception are all preserved in the architecture of the chambers DOMBRES. We leave the chamber now, leaving the Guild of Caged Geniuses to their silent, eternal work. Their genius, forged in isolation, created the most magnificent lie of the age, a flawless, mechanical mirror of the throne's impossible demands. Their story is the quiet tragedy of skill turned toward corruption, the ultimate cost of a king's desperation. To conquer a genetic flaw, the rhythmic clicking continues in the darkness, a lullaby of perfect, terrible precision. The memory of the artificer's subtle, silent hands remains, forever linked to the smooth, cold surface of the substitute heir. The knowledge of the flawless automaton was now secure. But how was this creation, this anatomy of the lie, actually brought to the public light? That brings us to the next chamber of the palace's secrets, the meticulous science behind the fabrication. The anatomy of the lie, how the king was measured and replicated, may the quiet stillness settle around you. The greatest lie of the Bourbon Dynasty was not fabricated from gold or deceitful diplomacy. It was constructed from measurements, meticulous study, and a terrifying act of forbidden science. To overcome the curse of their genetic flaw, the king sanctioned a secret project, the perfect replication of his own son. This process required an ultimate betrayal, the minute, chilling measurement of the true, frail prince's body to create a flawless mechanical substitute. The king's physicians, artists, and engineers collaborated in a dark, silent union, cataloging every contour, every gesture, and every shade of skin, turning the heir into a set of blueprints. The entire foundation of the monarchy was secretly transformed into a work of artful, calculating forgery built to perpetuate a glorious hoax. This is the buried knowledge of a life stolen by geometry. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn our gaze to the grim science of deception. We enter the clinical, cold reality of the royal workshops, moving beyond the glitter of the court into the realm of perfect inhuman measurement. The air here is clean, smelling of parchment and fresh, unvarnished wood. We must understand the chilling process, the literal deconstruction of a living prince into a series of specifications, templates, and mathematical formulas. This is where the human soul was reduced to a technical problem, and where the final, flawless body of the lie began to take its terrifying shape. The process began with the surveillance physician, Dr. Dubuya and his team. Their initial role was not curative, but investigative. They were tasked with creating the baseline data for the artificers. This required a profound act of moral decay, forcing the medical profession to abandon the Hippocratic oath in favor of state security. The true prince, isolated in the chambers d'ombres, was subjected to continuous, clandestine observation. Dubois's team utilized sophisticated, veiled instruments, early versions of calipers and depth gauges, disguised as children's toys or simple medical tools, to gather precise, anatomical data. The required measurements were astonishingly detailed. They needed the precise length of every bone, the circumference of every joint, the exact distance between the pupils, and even the resting weight of the prince's head when he slept. This was scientific espionage carried out against an innocent child. The king demanded that the mechanical replica be indistinguishable from the living prince when seen from a distance of 10 paces or more. This meant the illusion had to be perfect even under the unforgiving scrutiny of torchlight and sun. The most critical measurement was the gait and balance. Since the true prince suffered from an asymmetrical weakness caused by the genetic flaw, the automaton had to be engineered to move with an unnatural perfection of flawless, centered grace that defied the human tendency to favor one side. Artificers used weighted threads and plumb lines to create precise mathematical models of human balance, ensuring the machine's center of gravity remained fixed. Regardless of its movement, the aesthetic data was collected by a small, imprisoned group of court artists. These painters and sculptors were not commissioned for flattering portraits. They were required to produce hyper-realistic clinical studies. They used color palettes specifically designed to match the precise tone of the prince's lips, the subtle blue of the veins beneath his wrists, and the exact shade of the hair, which was then replicated using carefully selected human hair meticulously. Sewn onto the ivory scalp, every drawing was marked with cryptic numerical notations, a language known only to the artificers, detailing the exact depth and contour required for the carving. The final sculpture of the prince's face was not a work of emotional art, but a three-dimensional blueprint of cold, clinical precision. The king's involvement in this process was obsessive. He would often view the measurements and sketches, comparing the clinical perfection of the diagrams to the frail reality of his son. This act reinforced his conviction. The measurable, controllable certainty of the mechanical replica was far superior to the unpredictable weakness of the flesh. The anatomy of the lie was becoming the king's preferred reality. The artificers, receiving this mountain of data, the human body reduced to geometry and chemistry, began the material construction. The first phase was the creation of the core structure. This internal skeleton was not merely a frame, it was the primary mechanism for movement. They used high-density mahogany for the main trunk and limbs, selected for its stability and resistance to warping. The joints, however, were revolutionary. They were miniature systems of brass bearings and finely tuned steel tension springs, meticulously designed to mimic the smooth rotation of the human elbow and knee. Each joint was polished to a mirror shine and lubricated with a custom mixed oil that minimized friction and eliminated nearly all audible noise. The artificers were particularly obsessed with eliminating the sound of whirring. A whirring sound would instantly expose the forbidden knowledge to the court. They layered the internal moving parts with thin, treated layers of felt and leather, ensuring that the movement, though mechanical, possessed a soft, quiet grace. Mechanical silence that the court would interpret as royal composure. The mechanism for breathing was perhaps the most complex and psychologically crucial part of the lie. The automaton had to appear alive even when sitting still. They achieved this by using a low-pressure bellows system, manually charged and hidden within the lower abdomen. This system allowed the chest cavity, made of flexible leather stretched over thin ribs, to rise and fall with a shallow, regular rhythm. The breathing was purely an illusion of life, but it was essential to the deception. It was the visual proof that the prince was merely resting, not lifeless. This small, consistent movement was the centerpiece of the anatomy of the lie. The hands, as mentioned, required the greatest finesse. The artificers recognized that the hands often betray stress or fatigue. They developed a unique locking mechanism in the fingers that allowed them to remain in a natural, slightly curled position for hours, preventing any unnatural rigidity that might expose the deception. The fingers could be individually unlocked for specific, rehearsed gestures, like the slight wave or the holding of a royal scepter. The final layer, the skin of the lie, involved a toxic blend of art and science. The ivory was sourced from the cleanest tusks, carefully bleached and then polished to a deep, translucent shine. The surfaces were painted with thin, almost invisible layers of pigment, mimicking the subtle flush of blood near the cheeks and temples. They even implanted tiny, fine hairs using specialized needles to simulate the soft, human texture of a child's skin. The entire process was an exhaustive, terrifying fusion of state necessity and mechanical genius, proving that when the need for perfection is absolute, human skill knows no moral boundary. The Chambers des Ombres became a factory of flesh and metal, relentlessly pursuing the flawless substitution. The artificers did not stop at simply replicating the physical body. They had to replicate social interaction. They needed the automaton to appear engaged and receptive during long court ceremonies and public addresses. This was achieved through a revolutionary, miniature system of programmed response, a small, hidden lever built into the base of the automaton's neck and manipulated by a black guard attendant who stood perpetually behind the chair, allowed for limited, silent movements, the royal nod, a slow, 3-degree tilt of the head, signifying attention and agreement. The eye fixation, a subtle, mechanical shift in the eye crystals, allowing the automaton to appear to track the speaker in a controlled, unwavering manner. The hand of thanks, a single, measured rotation of the wrist, performed after receiving a gift or document. These pre-programmed, measured movements created the illusion of deep concentration and royal composure, which the court, already conditioned by the mandate of perfection, readily accepted as a sign of supreme dignity. The true genius of the anatomy of the lie was its ability to turn the automaton's limitations into perceived strengths. The machine's inability to blink naturally was interpreted as profound, unblinking focus. Its limited, silent movements were seen as reserved, superior grace. The very things that proved it was a machine were the things that made it a perfect. King. Dr. Dubois continued his observational duties, now charting the mechanical movements against the natural movements of the true frail prince. His journal details a creeping psychological fear. He worried that the perfection of the machine was slowly corrupting his memory of the human child. He wrote of having to stare at the true prince's hand for 10 minutes just to remember the subtle, natural curve of the fingers. A curve that was always slightly wrong compared to the flawless ivory replica. This was the moral decay. At its peak, the artificers created a physical lie. But the king created a psychological lie that demanded his servants forget reality. The blueprint of the automaton was replacing the memory of the sun. The ultimate act of replication involved the creation of the royal wardrobe. The king's own master tailor was forced to work in the chambers des Ombres, sworn to secrecy, crafting the miniature velvet coats, silk trousers, and ornate doublets. The tailor found the process unsettling. The automaton's body, though dimensionally perfect, lacked the give and subtlety of human flesh. The clothes had to be cut with slightly different, more rigid seams, to accommodate the unyielding quality of the wooden and metal joints. Her silent observations contributed another layer to the forbiddance, knowledge. He noted that the king's black guard attendants were constantly wiping down the hands and face of the mechanical heir with a specialized cloth, even in rooms that were not warm. The tailor correctly surmised that the material of the skin, being non-porous, held dust and oils unnaturally, requiring constant ritualistic cleaning to maintain the illusion of living health. This small, essential detail, the continuous, silent maintenance performed by the handlers, was a critical piece of the anatomy of the lie. The attendants were trained to hover near the prince, seemingly out of protective deference but actually to perform minute adjustments and cleaning that kept the illusion fresh and perfect. The construction phase neared its end, and the fear within the Chambers des Ombres reached a fever pitch. The artificers, having perfected their creation, now faced the transition period, the terrifying moment when their work would leave their control and enter the political arena. They knew that their continued life depended on the automaton's flawless performance. Master Emil's final technical blueprint included a nota, piece of defiant philosophy hidden within the cold mathematics. He drew a diagram illustrating the immense pressure placed on the central weight-bearing mechanism of the automaton's spine. He noted that the machine, though perfect, was carrying a mechanical load far beyond its designed capacity. He was speaking metaphorically. The machine was carrying the entire weight of the Bourbon lie, the king. in his final inspection, did not see the meticulous brass mechanisms or the frightened artisans. He saw only the perfect, silent body of the substitute heir, dressed in the royal velvet, its crystal eyes fixed in the gaze of profound, unblinking composure. It was everything the genetic flaw had threatened to take away. In that moment of triumph, the moral decay of the king became complete. He had successfully replaced the chaotic truth of life with the controllable perfection of artifice. He had manufactured his own succession. The final act of the anatomy of the lie was the official declaration. The afflicted, true prince was announced to be suffering from a delicate condition requiring perpetual isolation. A story that the court, already trained by years of secrecy, accepted without question. The path was now clear for the unveiling of the flawless, mechanical the true, deep success of the anatomy of the lie was not just in the craftsmanship of the automaton, but in the crafting of the narrative. The king, advised by his most ruthless ministers, ensured that the mechanical prince's public persona was already defined by the characteristics of the machine itself. They promoted the narrative that the prince was unnaturally stoic, possessing a level of royal reserve never before seen. His quietness was hailed as a sign of supreme contemplation. His limited, measured movements were praised as the height of noble grace. The public was conditioned to believe that this rigid, unblinking composure was the new standard of perfection. This psychological conditioning was essential. It meant that if the automaton ever showed a flaw, a stiffness, a pause, or an uncanny silence, the court would interpret it not as a failure of engineering, but as a mysterious, elevated sign of royal character. The lie was self-sustaining, protected by the very expectations it created. The artificers, watching from their secured chambers, saw the immediate success of their creation. They watched through tiny, carefully placed spy holes as the mechanical prince performed its first public duties. Accepting homage, nodding in solemn agreement, and holding the ceremonial sword with unflinching precision. Their forbidden knowledge had triumphed over the political reality, yet this success was a hollow victory for the artificers. They were forced to maintain the machine they had created, trapped in the darkness while their flawless invention basked in the light. Their moral decay was compounded by the fact that they were forced to take immense pride in the ultimate fraud. One of the most complex parts of the ongoing lie was the auditory deception. The automaton could not truly speak, but it was essential that it emit some sound to maintain the illusion of life. Artificers developed a series of small, concealed whistles and bellows, tuned to emit very faint, high-pitched sighs or intakes of breath. These sounds, controlled by a remote, hidden squeeze bulb operated by an attendant, were deployed during long silences. The court, hearing these faint, human sounds, reassured themselves that the silent prince was merely exercising profound restraint, rather than confirming that they were in the presence of an incredibly complex machine. The entire atmosphere of the court was built on these carefully controlled auditory and visual cues. The anatomy of the lie thus became a psychological masterpiece, where every element of the machine's fabrication was designed to exploit the court's desperate need to believe in the absolute perfection of the Bourbon line. Legacy of the King's Act was the institutionalization of the lie itself. The methods used to measure, replicate, and conceal the mechanical heir became standard operating procedures for the entire surveillance office. The anatomy of the lie became a historical template for how the dynasty would manage future crises of succession. The true, dark success of the entire project was not that the mechanical prince ruled, but that the king learned a terrible, corrupting lesson. The illusion of power is more stable than power itself. He learned that physical perfection could be engineered, and human frailty could be erased. This realization led him and his successors to embrace a philosophy of remote governance. They retreated further behind the walls of their palace, communicating with their people only through carefully manufactured decrees and impeccably staged public appearances. The emotional distance they created was a direct result of their reliance on the perfect, silent, unfeeling machine, the artificer's blueprints, the scientific record of how a human was turned into a machine. became the most powerful forbidden knowledge in the royal archives. They were the physical proof that the king had committed the ultimate moral decay, sacrificing the sacred nature of life for the security of his political image. The king's final, quiet triumph over his genetic curse was achieved through this cold, precise science of deception. The terrifying truth is that the machinery built to save the king's life ended up saving his throne, but only by destroying the humanity of the royal line itself. We are left with the chilling, lingering question: when the king was measured and replicated, did he not become just as mechanical as the creation he commissioned? Did the anatomy of the lie not ultimately consume the heart of the man who created it? The perfect, silent stillness of the deception settles around us now. We leave the archives now, carrying the blueprint of this cold, precise forgery in our minds. The anatomy of the lie was the scientific execution of a desperate king's command to replace a flawed reality with a flawless mechanism. The result was a dynasty ruled by a terrifying, beautiful simulation. The faint, steady heartbeat rhythm fades. The final, essential layer of the deception has been revealed, but the story of the mechanical prince is far from over. The final piece of the aesthetic puzzle, the one that guaranteed the illusion's success, still remains a secret. The materials that brought the machine to chilling, tactile life. The oil and ivory, the eerie texture of the royal skin. May the quiet stillness settle around you. The most unnerving element of the Bourbon King's lie was not the hidden clockwork, but the surface that deceived the world, the skin of the mechanical heir. It was a masterpiece of forbidden chemistry and carving, crafted from bleached ivory and polished with a secret organic mixture of rare oils. This skin had to pass the ultimate test, the human touch concealing the cold, hard reality of the mechanisms beneath. The entire deception relied on the tactile betrayal that made the substitute feel almost human, ensuring the court never suspected the terrifying truth of the curse that required this inhuman perfection. This eerie, lifelike texture was the final, devastating layer of the king's shameful creation, turning a machine into a political miracle. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn our attention to the final, most crucial stage of the forgery, the surface. We leave the realm of gears and geometry and enter the specialized laboratory of the artificers, where scent, texture, and light were manipulated to create the illusion of life. The air here is clean, smelling faintly of citrus and rendered beeswax. We must trace the unsettling process of turning cold, dead material into the perfect, warm-looking deception, the true, uncanny success of the clockwork lie. The artificers understood that the ultimate failure of any automaton is its texture. A machine can move, but its surface will always scream its inanimate nature. The king demanded a skin that felt not just soft, but subtly warm to the touch, capable of convincing a quick, ritualistic kiss on the hand or a brush against a velvet sleeve. The solution lay in the careful, almost religious application of two primary materials, the perfect, whitest ivory and a proprietary blend of oils. The ivory was sourced from the finest, most perfectly bleached tusks, ensuring the material possessed a translucent quality that could mimic the pallor of young, royal blood beneath the skin. The carving process was excruciatingly delicate. The artificers worked with miniature tools, carving the facial structures and hands into thin, overlapping plates that were then fitted onto the mechanical skeleton. The thickness of the ivory skin was strategically varied, paper-thin over the joints to allow for flexibility, and slightly thicker over the cheeks and forehead to capture and hold light. This subtle contouring was designed to mimic the softness of a child's face, ensuring that even under the harsh glare of 100 candles, the illusion of youth remained unbroken. The real magic, the forbidden knowledge in this process, resided in the oil blend. This was not merely lubricant. It was the final chemical veil of the deception. The oil mixture contained rendered animal fats, fine mineral oils, and a secret ingredient, a rare, naturally occurring resin that had the property of holding and radiating a subtle, persistent heat upon contact with human warmth. When applied to the ivory, This unique blend gave the skin an ephemeral, lifelike quality. It meant that when a courtier bowed and briefly kissed the prince's hand, they would register not the cold hardness of a material, but a fleeting sensation of warmth, a quick, sensory betrayal that instantly convinced the brain of the prince's humanity. The application of this oil was a ritual performed daily by the artificers. It was wiped onto the skin using specialized, soft chamois cloths, ensuring the layer was thin, even, and non-greasy. This continuous maintenance was crucial as the oil slowly evaporated, requiring constant replenishment to maintain the illusion of life's essential moisture. The hands and face, being the most exposed parts of the automaton, received the most meticulous attention. The ivory palms were slightly roughened on the inside to simulate the faint lines and unique friction of human skin, a detail designed to fool the sense of touch during a prolonged handshake. The artificers spent hours observing how natural light fell on the skin of the true prince, noting how the light captured the soft down of his cheeks. They then painstakingly replicated this effect, using the fine ivory dust left over from the carving process, applying it with dry brushes to create a subtle, almost invisible downy texture over the face. This ensured that the automaton looked soft, fragile, and utterly human. The moral decay of this process was profound. The artificers, masters of creation, were forced to use their highest skills to replicate the softest, most vulnerable parts of a child's body, knowing they were doing so to hide a political curse. They were creating a chillingly perfect symbol of youth that was, in reality, cold, hard, and utterly incapable of aging. The most unsettling detail of the mechanical skin involved the replication of blood. The artificers, under the direct instruction of Dr. Dubois, created a subtle, hidden effect that reinforced the illusion of life. They mixed tiny amounts of red and blue mineral pigments into the wax base of the oil blend. When this mixture was applied in very thin layers over the translucent ivory plates that formed the ears, the knuckles, and the lips, it gave these areas a faint, living hue. The thinness of the ivory allowed the light to scatter through the pigment, creating the optical illusion of blood circulating just beneath the surface. This was especially effective in low light, where the effect of the warm oil combined with the subtle color shift created an undeniable, palpable sense of life. The queen, witnessing the final result, was reportedly overwhelmed by a wave of revulsion and awe. The perfection of the replica, its terrifying closeness to the real prince, was a direct confrontation with the shame of her biological failure. She was forced to touch the skin, to accept the illusion, and to publicly praise the very artifice that had replaced her son. This act of public acceptance, touching the cold ivory and feeling the deceptive warmth of the oil, was the final confirmation of her complete psychological betrayal. The attendants who served the mechanical heir had to be specially trained in the care and maintenance of this unusual skin. They were given specific instructions on how to handle the automaton, primarily to avoid scratching the delicate surface, which could expose the brass mechanisms underneath. They were taught the exact ritual of the daily oil application, understanding that the skin was the most fragile yet most important part of the entire deception. One particular issue was the accumulation of dust and courtly oils. The non-porous ivory skin repelled normal dirt but attracted atmospheric oils and soot from the hundreds of candles in the palace. The artificers developed a specialized cleaning compound, a subtle, acidic agent hidden in a seemingly innocent perfume used nightly to gently strip away the residue, ensuring the illusion of living skin remained pristine. This necessary, continuous care was the ultimate proof of the lie's complexity. The artificers had not just created a perfect machine, they had created a perfect ritual of deception that demanded constant, silent participation from the highest levels of the royal staff. The moral decay had now spread to include every person who touched the skin of the clockwork prince. The eerie texture of the royal skin ensured the illusion's longevity. It proved that the most profound deceptions are not just visual or auditory, but deeply sensory. By deceiving the sense of touch, the king ensured that the truth remained buried beneath a flawless, man-made surface. The artificers, in their meticulous pursuit of lifelike texture, had to contend with the natural imperfection of the human body. They realized that a perfectly smooth, unblemished skin would look artificial. Therefore, they deliberately introduced flaws, tiny, microscopic imperfections that served to anchor the deception in reality. Using extremely fine needles and controlled pressure, they etched almost invisible lines near the corners of the eyes and mouth, simulating the subtle creases that form through a child's natural expressions. They even painted minute, almost undetectable freckles onto the cheeks, strategically placed based on the photographic evidence taken from the real prints. These carefully manufactured blemishes were the ultimate forbidden knowledge. The deliberate inclusion of imperfection to achieve a greater perfection of the lie, the eerie texture of the royal skin, was a triumph of psychological engineering. It taught the court what to expect from their prince: perfect movement and an unnerving, consistent pallor punctuated by tiny, carefully controlled imperfections. The court became so accustomed to the artificial standard that they later found the natural, messy vitality of the real prince when he was finally presented to be suspicious and unsettling. The moral corruption deepened with every coat of oil applied. The artificers, forced to create such intimacy with their construct, began to transfer a perverse form of artistic affection onto the machine. They saw the mechanical prince as their true child, a perfect creation born of their collective genius. Superior to the flawed human heir they were replacing, Master Emil's journal, in one of his later, more reflective entries, describes the chilling moment he finished the final polish on the automaton's cheek. I touched the skin, and for one terrifying moment I felt not the cold of the ivory, but the warmth of a life I had stolen. It is the most beautiful thing I have ever made, and its perfection is the proof of our collective sin. The oil and ivory was not just a material choice. It was a philosophical statement. It declared that the Bourbon Dynasty could transcend the limits of the human body, replacing flesh with artifice and biological failure with engineered perfection. The texture was the final, tactile piece of evidence for the king's belief in the supremacy of his political will over natural law, the knowledge of the oil blend. Its exact chemical components and proportions was fiercely protected. It was considered a state secret, more valuable than any treasury key, because without the oil, the illusion of life would quickly fail, exposing the cold, hard reality of the curse to the world. The artificers were the only priests of this secret, ensuring their perpetual servitude to the crown. The attendant's ritual of applying the oil became a subtle, unwritten dance within the palace. During long public ceremonies, the black guard attendant, standing close to the prince, would subtly fan the air near the automaton's face with a handkerchief. This action, seemingly motivated by courtesy, was actually a controlled effort to maintain the delicate humidity balance around the ivory skin, preventing it from drying out or cracking under the prolonged heat of the palace's lights. This constant, quiet vigilance was a hallmark of the lie. Everyone around the prince was involved in the maintenance of the illusion, either physically or psychologically. The entire court was complicit in the betrayal of the true heir. The eerie texture of the royal skin meant that the most public moments of the prince's life were also the most stressful for the artificers. A sudden spill of wine, a burst of rain during a parade, or a chance interaction with a child who might instinctively reach out to touch the prince's cheek. All these everyday occurrences were massive threats to the structural integrity of the deception. The attendants were trained to intercept any physical contact with a smooth, firm politeness, ensuring that no one could hold the prince's hand for too long, or test the warmth of his skin with prolonged touch. The brevity of any contact was the key to preserving the sensory lie. The moral decay of the king was evident in his increasing reliance on this manufactured surface. He began to believe that all problems could be solved by a sufficient application of oil and ivory if his people were restless. He believed a more perfectly staged public appearance, a flawless demonstration of royal composure, would suffice. He had learned to fear the messy reality of humanity and trust only the sterile perfection of the machine. The final triumph of the illusion was its enduring nature. Even after the mechanical prince was retired and the true, frail prince was presented to the world, the court struggled to adjust. They missed the unnerving perfection of the machine. They remembered the flawless ivory texture, the unblinking gaze, and the constant, reassuring stillness. The memory of the mechanical prince was now more powerful, more revered than the reality of the living king. The forbidden's knowledge, the recipe for the oil, the method for polishing the ivory, and the tiny imperfections that made the skin believable was successfully buried with the artificers. But the psychological consequence of that manufactured texture remains, a deep, lingering suspicion of human perfection itself. We leave the chamber and the secret of the skin behind us. The oil and ivory stand as a silent testament to the ultimate act of deception. The moment a king chose artifice over his own blood, the gentle heartbeat rhythm pulses in the silence. We have traced the fabrication of the lie, from its blueprint to its surface. But how did this perfect lie interact with the human observers? How did the king maintain the illusion during moments of close scrutiny? That brings us to the next chamber of the palace's secrets. The unsettling reality of the first great encounter. The private audience, the king, who met himself. May the quiet stillness settle around you, the greatest test of the Bourbon. King's lie was not before the masses, but in the terrifying intimacy of a secret chamber. The moment arrived when the afflicted true prince, sequestered and forgotten, was brought face to face with his perfect mechanical substitute, the flawless automaton built from oil and ivory. This was the king's ultimate cold act of betrayal, forcing the true heir to witness the life stolen from him, to silently observe the forbidden's perfection that wore his own face. The private audience was a profound psychological torture, a moment of crushing human despair meeting terrifying, unblinking mechanism. The king, watching this encounter, saw his curse both reflected and conquered, forcing him to choose the shameful certainty of the machine over the fragile reality of his own blood. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn our gaze to the most secure, most shadowed room in Versailles, a private chamber designed for absolute secrecy and moral accounting. The light here is low, dominated by the flickering yellow glow of heavy beeswax candles. We are seeking the moment of confrontation, where the living soul encountered its cold, precise replacement. This is the terrifying psychological core of the deception, where the king faced the mirrored image of his failure and his triumph, and where silence became the final, crushing judgment. The necessity of the private audience was driven by the artificer's final critical need, calibration. The automaton, though physically perfect by blueprint, needed its final atmospheric adjustments. Its systems for head tilt, hand rest, and posture needed to be tuned in real time, side by side with the true prince, ensuring the mechanical replica moved not just perfectly, but identically to the original in his moments of quiet. Royal reserve, the true prince, frail and isolated, was brought from his solitary wing under the cloak of deepest night. He was not told the purpose of his journey. He was simply guided, pale and weak, into the chamber, which was guarded by the stern, silent figures of the Black Guard. The room contained little furniture, a single gilded chair, a velvet chaise lounge, and the low, flickering candles that cast long, confusing shadows. And then he saw it, seated silently upon the chaise lounge, was a figure that was him, yet not him. It was a perfect, unblinking echo of his own face, dressed in the exact miniature velvet coat, its hands resting in a position of effortless, controlled repose. This was the clockwork heir, freshly assembled, waiting for its final, terrifying tuning. The initial shock for the true prince must have been profound, a silent, visceral horror. He was seeing the image of himself stripped of all life, yet imbued with an unnerving, polished perfection. The automaton's skin, treated with the proprietary blend of oil and ivory, possessed an uncanny, deceptive luminescence under the candlelight, making it appear both alive and ethereal. The king, accompanied only by Dr. Dubois and Master Emile, stood watching the encounter, hidden in the shadows near the doorway. This was not a moment of parental love, but of cold, scientific evaluation. The king's heart beat not with pity, but with the ruthless excitement of a gambler watching his final wager, the artificer. Emile directed the process in hushed tones. He instructed the prince, using simple gestures, to sit on the gilded chair, to rest his head against the high velvet back, and to hold his hands, clasped in his lap, all the positions that the automaton would need to maintain for hours during court functions. As the true prince complied, his hands betraying a slight, involuntary tremor, the subtle mark of the genetic curse, Emile would relay whispered adjustments to an attendant, working silently on the back of the automaton. The artificers were literally tuning the lie against the vulnerable truth. The adjustment process was excruciatingly slow, measured by the king's desire for utter flawlessness. The artificers worked to make the automaton's posture perfectly mirror the true prince's, but crucially, to do so without the tremor. They were refining the deception by eliminating the physical symptom of the shameful genetic flaw. The true prince sat there, fully aware that his every natural gesture was being recorded and corrected, used as a reference point for a machine designed to replace him. He was forced to become the unwitting co-creator of his own psychological imprisonment. The sight of the automaton's unblinking gaze, the crystal eyes that never wavered, must have been the most profound psychological stressor. The mechanical prince stared back with an unnerving, perfect composure, embodying the ideal that the true prince could never attain. Dr. Deboz's secret journal, if such an artifact existed, would be filled with the moral agony of that night. He was observing the direct collision of the living soul and the perfect mechanism. He noted the precise moment the true prince's eyes darted away from his. Mechanical double-N, instinctive recognition of the unnatural. He recorded the true prince's accelerated, shallow breathing, contrasting it with the automaton's slow, mechanically regulated chest rise, the breathing that was part of the anatomy of the lie. The king, observing this contrast, felt his belief in the forbidden's knowledge solidified. He saw his own son's weakness laid bare against the strength of the mechanism. His mind, corrupted by the mandate of perfection, fully accepted the automaton as the superior heir. The moral decay deepened with every tick of the clock. This private audience was the ultimate expression of the king's betrayal. It was not enough to merely replace the child. He had to use the child's very essence, his physical proportions, his unique presence to make the lie believable. The true heir was literally being cannibalized for parts of the deception. Master. Emile's greatest challenge during this audience was the final tuning of the hands. The true prince's hands would occasionally flex or twitch due to the underlying flaw. The artificers had to ensure the mechanical hands remained perfectly still, yet positioned exactly as the true hands rested. They achieved this by using the tension springs to maintain a precise, calculated stillness, eliminating all natural, human movement. The entire event was steeped in a terrifying shared silence. The prince could not speak for fear of betraying his isolated existence. The artificers could not speak for fear of execution. And the king did not speak for fear of compromising his cold, necessary resolve. The only sounds were the soft, muffled adjustments of the machine and the ragged breathing of the human prince. The silence of the private audience was more than just the absence of noise. It was the psychological manifestation of the king's complete moral decay. It was a silence that confirmed the truth that the king valued the silent, flawless performance of the machine over the messy, vulnerable communication of his own son. During one prolonged period of observation, Master Emile instructed the true prince to close his eyes, simulating sleep. The prince complied, and for a few minutes, the king had two identical forms before him, one breathing shallowly and weakly, the other silently, mechanically rising and falling. The king walked closer, studying the difference in the light, searching for any telltale sign of the automaton's true nature. He found only perfection. The ivory skin, treated with the oil blend, held the light with an unnerving fidelity. The artificers had succeeded in creating a lie that was aesthetically, sensorily, and geometrically flawless. The true prince, lying there with his eyes closed, was not truly sleeping. He was listening. He was internalizing the metallic perfection of his counterpart. He was forced to recognize the terrifying standard against which he would forever be measured. This experience was not just physically grueling, it inflicted a lifelong curse of inadequacy. He learned in that hour that his own natural human self was not enough to rule France. The king, in a final act of cold evaluation, instructed the blackguard to switch the positions of the two figures. The prince was moved to the chaise lounge, and the automaton was placed on the gilded chair. This was done to ensure that the machine was comfortable in all possible ceremonial settings. The moment the automaton was placed in the gilded chair, its concealed gyroscope system automatically compensated for the slight unevenness in the floor, maintaining a perfect centered posture. The true prince, in contrast, instinctively shifted his weight on the chaise lounge, a small human movement of discomfort. This tiny observation, the perfection of the machine versus the subtle frailty of the human, was the final confirmation the king required. The private audience concluded before dawn. The true prince was hooded and silently returned to his solitary wing, carrying with him the indelible memory of his perfect cold replacement. He was the living, breathing key to the entire operation. But now he was also its permanent victim. The artificers and Dr. Dubois remained, finalizing their records. Their work was complete. They had given the king his weapon against the genetic flaw, but they had also unleashed a profound psychological lie onto the world. The secrecy surrounding the private audience was absolute. Every participant, the blackguard, Dr. Dubois, and the artificers knew they possessed the forbidden knowledge that could shatter the dynasty and cost them their lives. This knowledge was too profound, too blasphemous to exist outside of this inner circle. The artificers were returned to the chambers des ombres, now armed with the final, critical data necessary to complete the automaton's social programming. They knew how the machine had to subtly adjust its weight, how its head tilt had to be precisely 3 degrees, and how long it could maintain the illusion of sleep without visible strain on its mechanisms. The moral burden on Dr. Dubois was particularly heavy. He was the only one who had recorded the minute physiological differences between the human and the machine. His journal entries from that night, if they survived, would speak of the overwhelming ethical violation. He had used his medical knowledge to facilitate a political lie, turning a sick child into a measurement device for his own replacement. The king, having witnessed the success of the calibration, felt a terrifying sense of self-justification. The private audience had proved that his choice of the machine was correct. His son's weakness was manageable only by replacement. The cold certainty of this conclusion destroyed any lingering parental guilt. He was now solely the politician, the protector of the dynasty, dedicated entirely to the maintenance of the hoax. The subsequent years of the true prince's isolation were marked by a profound internal struggle. He was haunted by the silent perfection of the automaton. He knew his public persona was merely an echo of a machine's flawless performance. This forced imitation of the inanimate was the final stage of the slow corruption of his soul. The encounter taught him a devastating lesson. The court did not want a messy, vulnerable human being as king. They wanted an abstract, unfeeling symbol of perfection. He learned to suppress his own human instincts, trying to mimic the stillness, the composure, and the emotional distance of the ivory and oil construct. The king, who met himself in silence that night, was not the true prince. It was the king's own political will meeting the perfect execution of his darkest command. And the silence confirmed that the machine was ready to usurp the throne. The single ticking sound continues in the absolute silence, marking the final moments of this secret history. The private audience was the unwritten, unseen prelude to the greatest public lie of the age. The mechanical prince was now complete, its movements refined, its surface perfect, and its performance validated by its living double. The king had his flawless heir, but the machine's public life carried new, terrifying risks that the king had to anticipate and manage. The risks of betrayal by sound itself. That brings us to the next chamber of the palace's secrets. The moment the machine nearly exposed the entire deception. The sound of the gears, a warning during a state Dinner. May the quiet stillness settle around you. The Bourbon King's flawless lie was almost shattered not by treason, but by a tiny mechanical fault, a sudden, high-pitched screech of brass on brass during the most critical moment of a state dinner. The mechanical prince, perfect in its oil and ivory skin, was engineered for silent motion, yet under the pressure of the palace atmosphere, its hidden mechanisms issued a chilling auditory warning. This was the moment the forbidden knowledge nearly exploded into public view, revealing the cold, unfeeling curse of the clockwork substitution. The sound of the gears was the machine's unintended betrayal, the only physical truth that could pierce the velvet deception and expose the king's shameful fraud. Silence was the crown's only defense, and for one terrifying minute, silence failed. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn our gaze to the most public, most opulent stage of the king's deception, the Hall of Mirrors during a state dinner. The air here is thick with the scent of foreign perfumes, roasting meats, and political tension. We are searching for a fault in the perfection, listening for the single, tiny sound that could unravel years of meticulous secret labor. Every gesture is magnified. Every silence is scrutinized, and the king waits, knowing that his fate lies not in the hands of God, but in the frictionless movement of a few hundred tiny, oiled components. The state dinner was the pinnacle of the mechanical. Prince's duties a necessary endurance test for the automaton. It required the machine to remain seated, immobile, and perfectly composed for many hours, subjected to intense heat from the fireplaces and candles, and the high humidity generated by hundreds of breathing bodies and steaming dishes. These environmental variables were the greatest threat to the artificers' meticulous work. The artificers, still caged in the Chambers des Ombres, received precise atmospheric reports from the Blackguard prior to the event. They anticipated the stress and had applied a slightly heavier grade of lubricant to the major joints, a contingency plan against the heat-induced expansion of the brass components. However, they underestimated the subtle, corrosive power of the psychological pressure on the entire room. The prince was seated in the place of honor, next to a visiting duke, a powerful political figure whose allegiance the king desperately needed to secure. The duke, a notorious observer of detail, was already unnerved by the prince's unblinking, unnaturally composed demeanor, the very composure that the king believed proved his perfection. The evening proceeded in agonizing slowness. The automaton performed its necessary, silent functions flawlessly. The slow, measured turns of the head to acknowledge a speaker, the perfectly regulated rise and fall of the chest, and the perfect stillness of the hands resting on the table. The illusion was holding, a triumph of mechanical engineering over the chaos of human reality. The moment of crisis arrived during the third course, a heavy, rich pheasant dish. The king, feeling a surge of confidence, signaled to the duke to drink a toast to the prince's future. The duke raised his glass, and the mechanical prince was subtly activated by its attendant, who was positioned just behind the chair. Disguised as a senior footman, the prince's hand, designed to perform a slow, measured lift of the ceremonial cup, began its movement. For the first few inches, the motion was flawless, silent, and fluid. But then, the attendant, perhaps sweating from the heat, or distracted by the duke's intense scrutiny, applied a fraction of a second. Too much tension to the hidden cable activating the wrist mechanism. The sudden, minute jolt created a momentary misalignment in the dry tension wheel of the elbow joint. It was not a roar, or even a loud grinding. It was a single, high-pitched, metallic screech, a brief, terrifying sound of brass scraping brass, a mechanical cry that cut through the velvet murmur of the court. It lasted less than a second, but in the echoing Hall of Mirrors, it seemed to suspend time itself. The sound immediately froze the duke's glass halfway to his lips. Every head at the table turned, their eyes not on the king, but on the prince. The silence that followed the sound of the gears was a vacuum, a terrifying absence of sound where the entire court held its breath, trying to process the auditory anomaly. The king's heart, hidden beneath the layers of silk and gold, must have plunged into panic. He knew, with absolute certainty, that he had just heard the voice of the forbidden's knowledge, the automaton. Meanwhile, froze in its movement, the ceremonial cup held rigidly in the air. Its perfect, unblinking eyes stared straight ahead, its polished oil and ivory skin gleaming under the candelabra. The very stillness that was meant to convey royal composure now only conveyed a frightening, inhuman rigidity. The Duke, his expression hardening with confusion, slowly lowered his glass. He was a man of science and precision, and the sound he had heard, a mechanical shriek, did not belong in the body of a boy. He looked not at the king, but at the prince's perfectly still hands, searching for a tremor, a spasm, a natural explanation, the saving grace. The only thing that prevented the immediate explosion of the lie was the sheer force of the mandate of perfection that the king had instilled. The court was so conditioned to ignore the unusual, to dismiss the imperfect, and to accept the royal narrative without question, that their immediate psychological reaction was to rationalize the sound. The queen, hardened by years of participating in the deception, executed the only possible maneuver with flawless speed and poise. She immediately feigned a sudden violent cough, a distracting, loud noise that simultaneously masked the automaton's failure and provided the court with a more human explanation for the momentary disruption. As the queen dramatically clutched her throat, the attendant behind the prince's chair, his face white with terror, instantly performed the emergency shutdown procedure. He released the tension on the automaton's wrist, causing the hand to drop the cup not in a smash, but in a controlled, calculated release onto the soft tablecloth. The resulting sound was a muted thud, which was instantly masked by the queen's loud, sustained coughing fit. The king, regaining his composure while simultaneously pretending to assist the queen, offered a strained explanation to the Duke, blaming the disruption on the poor acoustics of this older wing, or perhaps a tension in the floorboards. The Duke, though clearly unconvinced, nodded politely, forced by courtly protocol to accept the transparent excuse. The sound of the gears was silenced, but the warning was unmistakable. The king realized that his perfect, mechanical heir was vulnerable to something far more unpredictable than politics, the chaotic, uncontrollable reality of physics and human error. The state dinner did not immediately collapse, but the mood shifted profoundly. The king, terrified by the close call, ordered the automaton to be moved immediately. Claiming the prince was overcome by concern for his mother, the attendant gently guided the rigid figure away from the table, its perfect walk now hiding the panic that drove its movement. The moral decay of the king reached a new level that night. He was forced to sacrifice his wife's dignity, forcing her to enact a humiliating, public fit to save the integrity of a machine. The value of human reputation was nothing compared to the silence of the gears. Dr. Dubois was summoned late that night to the chambers des ombres, where the artificers were already in a state of high alarm, meticulously dismantling the automaton's elbow joint. The failure was minor, a tiny piece of brass dust trapped between the wheel and the spindle. But the consequence was catastrophic. The artificers worked furiously, knowing that their lives were now contingent on a swift, permanent solution. They realized that their primary fear, betrayal by an imperfect mechanism, had come true. The forbidden's knowledge was physically sound, but it was vulnerable to the mezzances of the external world. Master Emile proposed a radical solution, the complete redesign of the joint to include a microscopic, internal felt buffer and a customized lubricating system that would constantly coat the spindle with fresh oil, actively flushing out any potential dust or debris. This was a complex, time-consuming task, but the king's directive was absolute. The sound must never return. The king, meanwhile, paced his private chambers, obsessed with the Duke's reaction. He knew he had lost the Duke's trust, not through policy, but through a failure of spectacle. The sound of the gears had done more damage to his foreign relations than any failed treaty. This terrifying event led to a profound shift in the royal strategy. The king realized that public interaction was too dangerous. The risk of environmental stress or human error exposing the curse was too high. The longevity of the lie required a strategic retreat. the prince's public appearances were immediately reduced. His attendance at state dinners ceased entirely. The official explanation was that the prince required a period of intense study and intellectual development, removing him from the vulgar distractions of court life. This was the king's quiet confession of failure the machine could not withstand. Sustained scrutiny. The consequences of the sound of the gears rippled through the palace. The black guard attendant, though technically following procedure, was permanently reassigned to a remote, desolate post, a clear warning to all involved that any lapse, however small, would be met with swift, uncompromising punishment. The king was ruthlessly protecting the silence. The queen, having played her role perfectly, was also profoundly affected. She had saved the dynasty through an act of public degradation. The experience only deepened her moral decay, hardening her further against the unpredictable nature of her true son. She now saw all human vulnerability as a threat, preferring the rigid, silent safety of the machine's memory. The entire court internalized the warning. They learned that moments of intense silence were not restful, but dangerous. The air itself seemed to crackle with anxiety around the royal family, a constant, unspoken fear that the veneer of perfection could shatter at any moment. The shameful secret was palpable. Even if the exact nature of the lie remained buried, the sound of the gears was a reminder that no amount of forbidden knowledge or human genius could fully conquer the truth of materials and physics. The king had built a perfect machine, but he had failed to build a perfect environment for its operation. The imperfection of the world itself became the enemy of the perfect illusion. The artificers spent the next 6 months confined solely to the repair of the elbow joint, incorporating the new felt buffers and customized lubrication systems. They performed thousands of test movements, listening obsessively for the slightest hint of friction. Their anxiety was the final insurance policy of the lie. They knew the next sound of the gears would not be a warning. It would be an execution order. Master Emile recorded his reflection on the event. We were betrayed by a grain of dust. A testament to the fact that God's creations, however small, will always disrupt man's perfect imitations. The machine spoke its truth, and we were forced to silence it with fear and oil. The dynasty survived the crisis, but the sound of the gears created an irreparable fracture in the king's absolute certainty. He realized that the machine, his ultimate weapon against the curse, was also his greatest vulnerability. The illusion of perfection was sustained only by perpetual, exhausting, and costly fear. This event forced the king to confront the inevitable reality that the mechanical prince could not rule forever. The lie was too fragile, the risks too great. The time for the machine's glorious, quiet retirement was fast approaching. Silence is complete now. The sound of the gears has faded into the memory of the Hall of Mirrors, but the terrifying truth of that high-pitched warning remains. The king was given a choice by his own mechanism: risk everything on a continuous, fragile performance, or retire the beautiful fraud and find a new way to protect the throne. The choice, dictated by cold necessity, led to the final, necessary act of deception that brings us to the next chamber of the palace's secrets, the calculated, quiet removal of the machine from the stage. The final ritual, the disposal of a failed replica. May the quiet stillness settle around you, the darkest secret of the Bourbon court was documented not in political treaties, but in the private, hidden journal of the royal physician, Dr. Antoine Dubois. He was the sole witness to the agonizing moral madness required to maintain the king's lie. Dubois's true function was not to heal, but to act as the psychologist of the court, charting the escalating psychological betrayal of the king, the queen, and the true, isolated heir. He recorded the slow, internal corruption caused by the forbidden knowledge of the mechanical substitution, documenting how the family's soul withered while their public image flourished. His journal is the final, chilling testament to the curseless secret history, where all human feeling was sacrificed for the political perfection of a machine. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us move away from the glittering, deceptive surfaces and into the quiet corner where the true record was kept. We are in a small, private study, smelling faintly of ink and medicinal herbs. We must imagine Dr. Dubois, a man trapped by his own terrible knowledge, meticulously recording the emotional decline of the most powerful family in Europe. His work was the dark inverse of the artificers. They manufactured the perfect body. He documented the destruction of the perfect mind. He was the quiet chronicler of the royal family's descent into cold, calculated detachment. Dr. Antoine Dubois was not merely a court physician. He was the keeper of the dynasty's psychic health, a role that quickly turned into documenting their illness. He was present during the initial diagnosis of the genetic curse in the true prince, and he was the one who reluctantly certified the final blueprints for the automaton. His participation in the lie was total, forcing him to witness the complete collapse of the monarchy's moral framework. Dubois's most crucial secret duty was to monitor the psychological well-being of the king and queen. He observed how the constant pressure of maintaining the forbidden knowledge warped their personalities. His journal documented what he termed the inversion of affection. He noted that the queen, who had once been emotionally warm and spontaneous, grew rigid and distant. She reserved her public affection, her kisses, her smiles, her moments of maternal pride entirely for the automaton. Her true, afflicted son was seen only through the cold, clinical lens of state shame. Dubois wrote, "Her heart has learned to love the perfection of the image, and has forgotten the messy beauty of the living. She is a mother to a machine and a physician to her own child." The king's moral decay was even more profound. Dubois charted the king's descent into paranoia and emotional paralysis. The king began to see all of his ministers and courtiers as unreliable, flawed instruments, comparing them unconsciously to the flawless, predictable mechanism of the mechanical heir. Dubois noted the king's preferred method of relaxation was to review the automaton's maintenance blueprints, the anatomy of the lie-finding. Solace in the certainty of engineering. Dubois also documented the psychological torture inflicted upon the true prince. He noted the child's profound sense of betrayal after the private audience, describing the prince's silence not as mere withdrawal, but as a deliberate imitation of the automaton's composure. The boy was trying to achieve the stillness of the machine, believing it was the only way to earn his father's approval and escape the shame of the genetic flaw. The ultimate madness Dubois recorded was the court's reaction to the sound of the gears. He noted how the queen's public, feigned hysteria was a profound act of moral violation, but he also noted how the court preferred the hysteria to the mechanical truth. The court was so desperate to preserve the illusion that they embraced a dramatic lie over a terrifying fact. Dubois understood that his journal was not just a record. It was a profound act of defiance, the only way he could maintain his own moral sanity against the all-consuming moral madness of the crown. Dubois realized that the king's mandate of perfection had created a new, psychological state among the entire aristocracy: institutionalized detachment. This was the moral contagion that spread from the royal family to the court. Courtiers learned that the surest path to survival was to suppress all genuine emotion and display only the reserved, predictable composure that mirrored the clockwork heir. He wrote about the terrifying emptiness behind the eyes of the young nobles, noting that their studied stillness was a direct, unconscious mimicry of the automaton's unblinking gaze. The machine had not just replaced the prince. It had become the standard for emotional conduct, forcing the entire court into a collective psychological lie. The ultimate, slow corruption of the dynasty was documented in Dubois's reflections. The Bourbons, obsessed with suppressing a biological flaw, had inadvertently created a profound internal psychological flaw, complete inability to empathize or connect with their own people. This detachment, rooted in the shameful secret, was the true prelude to the revolution. The journal stands as the most critical piece of the buried knowledge, a silent, damning indictment of a king who chose the flawless, unfeeling mechanism over the vulnerable, beautiful reality of his own soul. We leave the private study now, leaving Dr. Dubois to his terrible, vital work. His documentation of the moral madness provides the true insight that the king's political lie was sustained only by the psychological betrayal of his entire family, a curse that poisoned the dynasty from the inside out. The pulsing, irregular heartbeat fades into silence. The human cost of the cold deception has been measured, but the machine's public life carried new, terrifying political risks that the king had to anticipate and manage. The risks of betrayal by the state itself. That brings us to the next chamber of the palace's secrets, the calculated, quiet removal of the machine from the stage. The moral decay of statecraft. Deceiving an entire nation, the greatest act of moral decay committed by the Bourbon monarchy, was not aimed at a rival king or an enemy state, but at their own people. The king's decision to replace his afflicted son with a clockwork automaton became a permanent betrayal of the entire nation. Every public appearance, every decree signed by the perfect, silent machine was a calculated lie, forcing an entire society to kneel before a forbidden piece of artifice. This systemic deception required the entire framework of French statecraft, its ministers, its diplomats, its army, to become co-conspirators in the hoax. They were forced to maintain the myth of the flawless heir, turning the kingdom into a vast, silent stage dedicated to upholding the king's shameful secret. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn our gaze from the private chambers of the king to the grand, public machinery of the state. We are looking at the vast, complex systems of government, all quietly compromised by one hidden flaw. The air here is cold, sterile, and heavy with the weight of official secrecy. We must trace how the necessity of preserving the clockwork lie corrupted every single function of the administration, turning governance itself into a meticulous performance of deception. The moment the king decided to unveil the mechanical prince, the moral decay of statecraft became inevitable. The operation required the entire government apparatus to be weaponized for one single purpose. Maintaining the silence, the council of ministers were not told the full truth. They were simply presented with an unshakable, non-negotiable directive. The heir is frail but miraculously recovering, yet requires absolute composure and quiet management. They were forced to craft their policies economic, military, and diplomatic around the constraints of the machine. For instance, major diplomatic treaties or military mobilizations could never be announced in the prince's immediate presence, for fear that the emotional strain or a sudden, loud gesture might trigger a mechanical fault like the one heard during the sound of the gears. This constraint meant that crucial, time-sensitive decisions were often delayed or communicated through circuitous, easily compromised routes. Purely to protect the inanimate heir, the Ministry of Communications was tasked with creating a false public narrative, portraying the prince's unnaturally reserved nature, his unblinking gaze and rigid posture as supreme dignity and intellectual depth. They subtly altered official portraits and commissioned court poets to write verses praising the prince's preternatural stillness, turning the machine's limitations into virtues. This constant, systemic dishonesty corroded the public trust. The people were being trained to believe in an illusion, and the truth of the state's actions became secondary to the perfection of its image. The king's moral decay was reflected in his management style. He began to value pliancy over competence. Ministers who asked too many questions, who sought verifiable facts, or who expressed genuine, messy human emotion were swiftly removed. He preferred cold, silent executors, men who could manage the lie without needing to understand the human cost. The true hidden function of the state became not to govern the people, but to manage the illusion. Every department was forced to play its part in the grand fraud, sacrificing their own integrity to uphold the king's shameful secret. The most direct corruption occurred within the Chancellery of Official Records. Every document signed by the automaton, a process that required a carefully choreographed, mechanical movement, was a legal betrayal. The artificers developed a complex system where the prince's ivory hand, equipped with a miniature clockwork mechanism, could be triggered to sign with a perfect, repeatable imitation of the royal script. The chancellery officials, sworn to verify the signature as that of a living sovereign, were forced to commit institutional perjury. They knew the signature was not the work of a hand guided by a soul, but by springs and gears. This act of forgery, repeated hundreds of times over years, rendered the very legality of the Bourbon state null and void, all to protect the facade of the perfect heir. The moral madness also infected the military. General staff were given veiled instructions that the prince, when present at ceremonial reviews, could not be exposed to loud artillery fire or sudden, jarring movements. This constraint impacted the training of troops and the design of parades, forcing military discipline to bend to the fragile needs of the mechanical substitution. The king's total reliance on the forbidden's knowledge, the silent, unseen machinery, caused him to govern with an increasing sense of isolation and detachment. He believed his greatest strength was his ability to manufacture his own reality, leading him to ignore genuine warnings and advice from his ministers. He confused the smooth, silent operation of the automaton with the smooth, silent operation of a well-governed nation. The psychological lie at the heart of statecraft ensured that when the real crises hit the economic downturns, the foreign policy failures, the king was fundamentally incapable of responding with human empathy or flexible judgment. He sought a mechanical, predictable solution where none existed. Dr. Dubois, observing this decay, noted in his secret journal that the king had achieved a terrifying goal. He had turned his entire state into an extension of the Chambers des Ombres, a massive, complex machine whose only real function was to maintain the silence around the central lie. The ultimate betrayal was that the Bourbon state, built on the mandate of perfection, sacrificed its own integrity, its own truth, and its own capacity for humane governance, simply to avoid the shameful genetic flaw of one small child. We leave the ministries and the chancellery carrying the weight of this institutional lie. The moral decay of statecraft shows that the king's choice of the machine corrupted not just a family, but the entire political body of France. The nation was deceived, its laws were forged, and its government was paralyzed, all to secure the silence around the clockwork heir. The faint metallic clatter fades into the silence. The shame of the deception is absolute, but the quiet performance of the automaton was not the only source of the moral corruption. What about the human beings who had to physically maintain the flawless illusion every single day? That brings us to the next chamber of the palace's secrets, the agonizing, terrified service of the woman closest to the machine. The seamstress's terror, dressing the lifeless body, the most intimate, terrifying secret of the Bourbon Palace, belonged to a single seamstress, Madame Dubois, whose daily task was to dress the mechanical prince. She was the one who touched the cold, lifeless body beneath the velvet, experiencing the ultimate silent betrayal of the senses. Her terror was not of the king, but of the eerie texture of the oil and ivory skin, the flawless lie she was forced to encase in the highest finery. This forced intimacy with the forbidden's construct became her personal curse, making her a silent conspirator in the king's shameful deception of the entire nation. She was the unwilling participant in the most grotesque of state rituals, dressing a flawless automaton as the perfect embodiment of human majesty. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn our gaze to the most private room in the prince's wing, the antechamber where the day's great spectacle began. The light is dim, filtered by heavy drapes, and the air is thick with the scent of fine materials and anxiety. We are observing the silent, precise ritual of dressing the mechanical heir, tracing the terror of the woman whose hands provided the final, soft veneer of humanity for the cold, clockwork lie. Madame Dubois, no relation to the physician, though perhaps bound by a similar dark fate, was the royal seamstress responsible for the prince's ceremonial wardrobe. Her skill was legendary. She could cut velvet and silk with an almost supernatural precision. Yet, her professional pride was utterly destroyed by her secret task. She was summoned to the prince's chamber every morning, accompanied only by the prince's silent attendant and a single member of the Black Guard. The room was kept unnaturally cold to preserve the integrity of the automaton's internal mechanisms, ensuring the brass gears did not expand due to heat. Lesson learned bitterly after the sound of the gears. Her greatest terror began when she had to lift the mechanical prince. Though sized like a child, the automaton was heavier than expected, weighted with brass and steel counterbalances designed for stable movement. Its body was rigidly cold, resisting the natural give of human flesh. Madame Dubois had to maneuver the heavy unresponsive form, pulling the stiff limbs and unyielding torso into the intricate sleeves and elaborate trousers. This required a profound act of moral decay on her part. She had to willfully suppress her own instinctual revulsion. Her hands, trained to the warmth and softness of human fabric and skin, were forced to grapple with the cold, hard, unnatural resistance of the clockwork figure beneath the fine linen. Her movements had to be slow, deliberate, and perfectly controlled. A sudden, jarring movement could dislodge a joint or interfere with the delicately tuned tension springs. The constant pressure of this impossible task created a perpetual state of nervous dread, she noted. In her later private reflections, written on scraps of hidden, lining fabric, that the most unnerving part was the prince's unblinking gaze. The crystal eyes, fixed in an expression of unnerving composure, seemed to watch her every move, making the lifeless body feel profoundly, secretly aware. When she pinned the ceremonial sash across the chest, she had to carefully avoid the location of the hidden bellows that simulated the breathing. She was aware that she was dressing an entity that was performing the very act of living, yet was utterly, coldly inanimate. It was a profound violation of the natural order, and she was the one who provided the final, elegant costume for the fraud. The king's deception relied entirely on her skill. If the clothes bunched, or if the intricate embroidery stretched unnaturally, the illusion of the perfect royal form would be betrayed. Her flawless stitching was the necessary accomplice to the king's lie. The meticulous nature of her work meant that Madame de Bois was one of the few individuals who knew the full anatomy of the lie. She knew, for instance, that the prince's left shoulder was slightly wider than his right, not because of biology, but because the primary drive mechanism for the arm required slightly more space in the mahogany frame. She had to cut the miniature military jacket sleeves with a subtle, non-symmetrical bias. A subtle betrayal of tailoring rules to hide the cold, hard truth of the mechanism. The forbidden's knowledge was physically imprinted on the clothes she made. Every ceremonial outfit, every velvet coat, every elaborate vest was, in effect, a custom-built mechanical shroud, tailored not to a human body, but to a complex, unyielding machine. The silk tights, which covered the legs, had to be of a special weave to prevent static electricity from interfering with the concealed wires and internal components. The king's concern was total. No detail could be left to chance, lest the curse be exposed by a static discharge or an ill-fitting sleeve. One morning, during the final moments of the dressing ritual, Madame de Bois accidentally grazed her bare hand against the prince's cheek while adjusting his collar. She instantly registered the deceptive, ephemeral warmth of the oil and ivory skin, a sensation she knew to be a chemical, not biological, reality. That quick sensory moment of fabricated life was, she later wrote, the most chilling experience of her life, the feeling of perfect, cold wrongness. Her terror was compounded by the knowledge that she could never speak of what she saw. Her professional reputation, her family's safety, and her very life depended on her absolute, total silence. She was imprisoned by her unique knowledge, a silent co-conspirator in the king's monstrous hoax. The moral decay of the court reached even this small antechamber. The king's willingness to exploit her fear and skill, forcing her into this grotesque intimacy with the deception, was the final measure of his cold, calculated ruthlessness. The seamstress's terror was the price paid by the innocent. For the continued glory of the shameful crown, she was forced to look upon the truth every day. And yet she had to act as though she saw only the flawless reality of the divine right. Her silence, stitched into the very fabric of the royal wardrobe, was the thread that held the entire lie together. We leave the antechamber and the silent, terrified seamstress. Her daily ritual of dressing the cold, unyielding form stands as the ultimate symbol of the moral decay of statecraft, the moment human skill and human feeling were entirely subjected to the political needs of a machine. Her terror was the price of the crown's perfection. The slow, steady ticking fades into the quiet. The immediate human cost of the deception has been documented, but what of the true political cost? How did the nobility respond when they began to suspect the perfection was unnatural? That brings us to the next chamber of the palace's secrets, the chilling realization of the privileged class. The silent witness, a single surviving copy in a private library.